Well, hey folks, if you want to get really angry, this is the case for you. Gareth Pursehouse is charged with murdering Dr. Amie Harwick, a California marriage and sex therapist who was brutally murdered, and it's taken 5 years to get to this point. She was the former girlfriend of actor Carey. I don't know why that makes a big deal, but everybody keeps talking about it. But when you watch this one, you are going to be incensed. Hey, well, thanks for joining us here at Profiling Evil. I'm working out of my New York office today, and I just had a chance to jump on Court TV and talk a little bit about the closing arguments in that Gareth Pursehouse case. Now, you'll remember this one because this guy is accused of planning and carrying out the murder of Dr. Amie Harwick, this really quite accomplished marriage counselor from the Hollywood area in California. Now, the thing that's so intriguing about this is the prosecution laid out, I think, a pretty solid case that suggested that Gareth Pursehouse couldn't get over the fact that she wanted nothing to do with him. And he eventually worked his way in to where he talked to her and then he murdered her. But here's the thing. He brought with him items that would suggest that this was premeditated, that it was thought out, and that it was an organized crime that went completely disorganized once the murder started to unfold. I want you to pay close attention as we talk with Court TV today about this case. And first, I want to thank you for supporting us. Hit that like and subscribe button, do all that stuff. And let's go in to my comments on Court TV as we talked about this case.
Mike King, turning now to the Hollywood obsession murder trial that we've been following this afternoon here on Court TV. We saw the prosecutor put forth what I thought was a fantastic closing argument, really laying out the reasons why this was about a murder, an intentional murder, and he was lying in wait. That was intentional as well. What we saw just before we sort of went to break was the idea that the defense was claiming this wasn't about intent. This was about such deep emotional disturbance that this defendant could not form the intent. Your thoughts on that direction by the defense?
Well, thanks for having me, and my apologies for not dressing appropriate for court today. On a flight to New York, I think my bags have gone on vacation somewhere else, so please forgive me. But the thing that really stands to me on this particular case is the fact that the defense is doing all they can do, try to humanize this guy and get the jury to feel some compassion and try to give him some hope in life. But it's really hard to get past the idea of bringing syringes to the crime scene and other things that are indicative of premeditation, pre-thought, pre-planning, and what originally would have started as organization. And Michael, I go back to this guy creeping into the area, trying to avoid the doorbell cameras and other things. There was a great deal of organization going on, and then once things start happening, then we see all this disorganization, which thankfully leaves evidence that makes it possible to convict people on this. But to say in the 11th hour, hey, you know, this poor guy just was jilted and couldn't get over a girl, you got to take into account all the evidence that was presented over this trial, and it really does point toward the premeditation that the state is alleging.
Yeah, no doubt. In the rebuttal, I can hear them say that, yeah, there was an emotional disturbance, but it just drove him to kill. I mean, that's basically what happened here. He knew exactly what he was doing. And there was one line that he said, guys, about the nicotine. He said, where did that come from? You know, you can't just pick that up anywhere. So that, I mean, it just really, a light went on and said, you know what? He was sitting in that house planning this thing for quite a while. All right.
Well, folks, I hope it's pretty obvious that I was really frustrated as we talked about this case, and that I wasn't buying this poor guy's excuse that he's just a victim of all these bad circumstances. And if people would have treated him a little better, if he'd have gotten warm cookies and cool milk, that maybe he wouldn't have turned into a killer. Doesn't matter. He did turn into a killer, and now he has to face this thing. Justice has to be served, and he has to face the consequences of it. But the big question is, why is this a defense attorney spending so much time making him out as a victim? It's almost it's almost embarrassing for the family of this victim to listen to him, almost victim shaming at times. And I want you to hear what my comments were on Court TV about that particular piece of it, because I think I got a little animated. In fact, I got so animated that I even said, "Holy cow."
Relationships with them. He was trying to resume his normal life, but it was obvious he couldn't, because he showed up at her house still suffering under the emotions that he had described to her that he had been suffering since they broke up. So after seeing Amie, Gareth tried to recover his fragile equilibrium, but he was consumed by his emotions. This was not an attempt for him to cover up a crime. He's not aggressive with her. He's not saying he's entitled to anything. He's just telling her how vulnerable he is and how needy he is. Something that's difficult for him to do, but he did it.
Yeah, and Mike, you know, that idea that maybe there's a little bit too much victim blaming here is a problem as well. Got to be very, very careful. But I do understand where she's going. Again, one of the things she has to do is try to knock this case down from an intentional situation to one that he probably was either provoked into doing or didn't have the intent on doing. So I understand where she's going, but to spend the first 30 minutes talking about how, you know, poor old Gareth Pursehouse was emotionally triggered by being rejected, I'm not sure that was the way to go.
Boy, I'm with you, Michael, and I just am thinking to myself, I don't even know if the defense attorney believes this story herself. And frankly, it might be the only thing that she can do at this point is try to appeal to the emotion of the jury. But holy cow, no means no. Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether your feelings are hurt or not. If you've been told this isn't working, it's time to go away, you go away.
That's right.
Well, I hope you'll put your comments down below on this one. How would you vote if you were on the jury? And before you make that decision, I'm going to just pull out the prosecution's closing arguments and the defense closing arguments for you to listen to. It's going to be pretty long, but it'll give you the best cliff notes of the entire case, and then you can make a decision for yourself. I want to thank you for supporting Profiling Evil. I hope you're watching our podcasts on YouTube, if you're paying attention to us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And above all, if you're looking and you're listening to podcasts, I hope you're going to Profiling Evil Podcasts and checking us out there. Thanks so much for your support of Profiling Evil, folks, and we'll see you soon at the next crime scene.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Amie Harwick was brave. She wanted to live. She fought to live. She had a good life, and her friends thought she was this amazing person. They knew she was an amazing person. And so, she fought bravely. She punched, she scratched, but she was up against an opponent, a man who knew that he was much bigger than her, knew he was much stronger than her. Someone that his intent was not only to harm her, but to kill her. Because he feels entitled to her. Because of that relationship they had in the past, he feels that he could force himself back into her life. Not just that he's obsessed. It's about his feelings. It's about the pain he feels for not having her. Amie Harwick fought to live. Amie Harwick showed this defendant kindness when she tried to appease him, tried to appease his anger. When she texts back, move on. Move on with your life. Respect my boundaries. But it's about this entitled defendant. It's about his feelings. He didn't care what Amie wanted. He didn't respect her boundaries. It's all about him. And so she shows him kindness, and he plots to kill her. He finds nicotine, a lethal poison. He breaks into the sanctuary of her home and waits for her to catch her off guard. Can you imagine the terror for Amie when she first saw this defendant after that buildup? When she's getting punched and beaten. This is not a struggle. Defense used to call this a struggle. This is an assault upon Amie. And he strangles her. And you heard in 15, 20 seconds, you could lose consciousness. And so people sometimes will ask, based on the evidence in this case, do you believe she was conscious or unconscious after he strangled her? After Michael Herman yelled out, "Hey, motherfucker," and alerted him that there was someone else in the house. Was she conscious or unconscious after that moment? We hope she was unconscious. Because to be semi-conscious, fatigued, or conscious in those last moments, he delivered pure violence and terror to her. When, if she's semi-conscious and he picks her body, drags it over to the balcony, and picks her up, lifts her over the rail, and then drops her, and if she's conscious and she knows that's happening to her, and her body cannot fight back, cannot fight him anymore, and that's what he did to her. This is the time, ladies and gentlemen, now to hold this defendant accountable for his actions. The evidence in this case, when you look at all the evidence in this case, there's only one reasonable interpretation. It points to his guilt, the crimes of burglary, murder, and lying in wait, catching her off guard to kill her. Whatever love he had in the past, that love has turned to anger and hate. He is Amie's fear. He chooses Valentine's Day to end her life. He chooses a lethal poison, nicotine. I mean, where does that come from? He lays in wait. She's out on Valentine's Day with her friends, living her life, thinking everything's fine. She doesn't know what's waiting for her at home. Can you imagine that? He's there waiting in her sanctuary for 3 to 4 hours with a lethal dose of nicotine, gloved up. He assaults her, he strangles her. He wants Amie to know who's doing this to her. He doesn't have a space cover. This message is going to be sent. You don't just block me. You don't cut me out of your life. We had something. He needs Amie to die. If Amie lives, then his life is over. She saw him, he's in her house. His life is over if she survives. She will identify him, tell the police, he's done. See, what he cares about is himself. He's selfish. He cares about his feelings, his pain. And he doesn't care if he kills Amie, as long as he gets away with it, as long as he's free. So when you really look at all the evidence in this case, it clearly points to his guilt. Guilt to breaking into her home, to killing her in the first degree, which means premeditated and deliberate, which also means lying in wait, and the special circumstance of lying in wait. And I'll explain all these charges in a moment to you. I'm going to take you through all this. But some of you may have been jurors in other trials. Some of you, this may be your first time as a juror. And you're probably thinking to yourself, I want to be a fair and impartial juror. I want to do the right thing here. Well, for some of you who have not been jurors, there are certain things a juror, a fair and impartial juror, cannot consider. For example, sympathy. I'm not asking you to vote guilty because you feel sympathy for Amie Harwick. But by the same token, I don't know if, we spent all this time with the defendant here in court. I don't know if he reminds you of someone you know. Shouldn't let that enter into your deliberations, whether you feel anything like that for the defendant. Punishment. You cannot render a fair verdict if you start considering punishment. I wonder what the punishment is going to be. Well, you know the punishment is great for murder, but it's up to the court to decide what the punishment will be after you render a verdict of guilty on these charges. Bias. I don't like law enforcement. I do like law enforcement. I don't like defendants. I do like... That doesn't come into play here. Passion. No, it's not about passion. Look at the facts and look at the evidence. This is where a juror sometimes will get in trouble. Speculation. They start guessing or speculating about evidence that we never talked about. Witnesses who never testified. So don't speculate. Other evidence that you never heard of. Other evidence that someone may have mentioned but it was never introduced. Don't speculate about what that would be. Attorneys. This is not about the attorneys. This is, I like that attorney, I don't like that attorney. It's not about that. And I know you're not going to make it about that. It's not about a social justice. It's not about the defendant's a defendant. How do I balance things out? It's not about that. What can a jury, a fair and impartial juror, consider? Well, consider what's in the circle, the elements of the crime. You're going to get a copy of those jury instructions, and it's going to tell you what elements that people have to prove for murder and for the special circumstance of lying in wait and all the other crimes. Testimony of witnesses. You know, there's a reason why this witness stand is so close to the jury. It's so you can be close enough to watch their demeanor while they're on their stand. How do they respond to the questions of attorneys? You can hear their voice. Do they answer right away? Do they hesitate? When Robert Koshland testifies that Amie was this amazing person, is he just making that up? When he says, the reason I talk to people is because I want people to know about her, not just that she was someone's fiancée. There's more to her than that. So you judge the credibility of witnesses. Exhibits. You're going to get all those exhibits we introduce in front of the jury. You're going to have those back there so you can review them, including the videotapes, the ring videos, what have you. The law. You're going to have the law. Remember, you all said one thing when we're selecting a jury. We will follow the law as given to us by the court. And this is why you're going to convict them of burglary, of murder in the first degree, and the special search of lying in wait when he committed this murder. Logic and common sense. Aside from the law, you know what happened here. This is not a defendant who was depressed, and the depression made him go get nicotine, made him go get gloves, made him cover up cameras, made him wait for 3 to 4 hours. No. Logic and common sense. That's why you're going to vote guilty on all these charges. What is the truth? Well, the truth is not just because I'm telling you what it is. The truth is, who do the witnesses corroborate? Paramedics. Michael Herman. Her text messages about fearing this defendant, what he was going to do to her. The evidence corroborates only one reasonable interpretation. That he broke in with the intent to kill her. Does the defendant have a motive? Or is this someone just got picked up from the street and the police officers are blaming this person? No. You have those text messages. You have their interaction at XBiz. You have the anger he had. Physical evidence. The ring videos, his DNA at the location, 1 out of septillion, that's him. But you also have the ring video showing that it's him. Yet we spent so much time on different questions on these witnesses. Amie's injuries tell you a story of how he beat her. Not a struggle, a beating. They're not, the same size and weight. They're not like fighting it out. Statements by defendant that incriminate him. I just interneted your phone. Whatever he's telling other people on those recordings, those jail visits. Whatever he's saying in front of those people at the XBiz. You ruined my life, bitch. The reasonable interpretation of circumstantial evidence. So this is an important instruction. Direct and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is like we had a witness right there that saw them do it, right? We don't have that. In most crimes, you're not going to have necessarily a witness who sees the crime on the 3rd floor of this bedroom committing it. But what you have is circumstantial evidence. Because circumstantial evidence does not directly prove a fact, to be decided, but is evidence of another fact or group of facts from which one may conclude the truth of the fact in question. For example, videos, physical evidence, defendant's text messages, victim's physical injury. So the circumstances, what do the circumstances tell you about what happened and about defendant's intent? And you know, in TV sometimes you hear, all they have is a circumstantial evidence case, as if that's not better than someone identifying someone who could be mistaken about their identification. Both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable as a means of proof, and neither is entitled to greater weight than the other. So circumstantial evidence is as good as direct evidence. So I would argue sometimes better, because sometimes you can't change the circumstances. You can't change the written video. You can't change the DNA. You can't change him wearing gloves. You can't change the strangulation marks on her neck. So if there are two reasonable interpretations of the circumstantial evidence, it favors the defendant. However, if there's only one reasonable interpretation, you must reject the unreasonable interpretation, that he just went there to talk to her, that he was going to cause himself some harm. That's not the reasonable interpretation of the circumstances when he's gloved up, covering cameras, breaking into her house. When he breaks in, he has a lethal dose of nicotine. You know what the reasonable interpretation is of the evidence in this case. So you reject unreasonable interpretations, that he was there just to talk, that he was there to cause himself harm. You know, during this trial, the defense cross-examined various witnesses, my argument to you is this is what the defense basically boiled down to in those questions to witnesses. Shifting blame. He was, during the opening statement, counsel said, defendant was so debilitated after seeing her. He got into this depression and Amie wouldn't talk to him. But like, Amie has a responsibility to talk to someone that acts like this? Why didn't the paramedics take her sooner to the hospital? Well, how does that change that you strangled her and that you threw her over the balcony? How does that change that? There's excuse after excuse, as if the defendant is a child. He's a 41-year-old man who couldn't move on. She blocked him, and for that, you get this? Excuse after excuse. This woman, Amie Harwick, wanted to be left alone. She wanted to be respected. And he didn't do any of that. He didn't respect her boundaries. He didn't care. But the defense makes, and they're questioning the witnesses, excuse after excuse for him. And you should ask yourself, when you hear these questions that are excuse after excuse for the defendant, how does that change defendant's plan, evidence of his plan? How does that change that he's identified as the killer? How does that change his cover-up? Those text messages to women 2 hours right before he breaks in, laughing at text messages of other women within 46 minutes after throwing her over the balcony. How does it change her injuries, the strangulation, the beating? How does that change that? It doesn't. But it is a distraction. It could distract the juror that they keep pointing out issues that they brought up with these witnesses, which really doesn't change what he did. So don't be distracted, ladies and gentlemen. Focus on the actual crime, his actual actions, what he did here. You know, counsel kept asking, well, how about these Nest cameras? Well, they should have subpoenaed for the Nest cameras the very next day. And you heard the evidence. They got the videos, they don't show much. Defense counsel just threw it out there. Was there a camera on the third floor? There's no evidence that there was a camera on the third floor or that one was working. So why just plant that for the jury out there? Why not confront a witness and say, is this the camera we're talking about? Are these the videos we're talking about? Don't be distracted, ladies and gentlemen. Focus on the evidence. You are to consider all the evidence in the case. The law. So I'm going to explain the law to you in a moment. We've charged the defendant with 2 counts here. Count 1 is murder. So you're going to decide, did he commit murder? Did he kill a human being, Amie Harwick, without justification? you're going to find that it is murder. And then you're going to decide, your next question is going to be, is it murder? All murder starts off as second degree. Is this murder of the first degree? And I'll explain to you what gets you to first degree. It is murder of the first degree. Basically, what gets you to first degree is either it's premeditated and deliberate, meaning you thought about it, you considered it beforehand, or also murder while lying in wait. Did you catch someone off guard when you killed them? After you find that it's murder of the first degree, your next question will be, is the special circumstance of lying in wait true? Did he kill her? Did he catch her off guard when he killed her? And the answer is true. The second count is burglary. You can decide, did he break into her home? Is it second degree burglary or first degree burglary? First degree burglary is when you break into someone's residence. It's residential, where someone lives. There'll be a special allegation. Was there a person present when he broke in? Yes. We all know that Michael Herman was present. So you're going to find this true. And that's it. Murder defined. A human being was killed, Amie Harwick. The killing was unlawful. And the killing was done with malice aforethought. This language, malice aforethought, doesn't mean, it means he thought about it beforehand. In other words, it didn't just happen in that second. It was thought before that. I want you to, cause of death. There's an instruction that defines your cause of death. And that causes death if the death is direct, natural, and probable consequence of the act, and the death would not have happened without that act. A natural, probable consequence is one that is a reasonable person would know is likely to happen. And I'll explain that to you in a moment. More than one cause of death. There may be more than one cause of death. An act causes death only if it's a substantial factor in causing death. A substantial factor is more than trivial or remote. However, it does not need to be the only factor that causes death. And here's why. Because a lot of those questions of the defense, it almost seems to shift blame to the paramedics, law enforcement, for not taking her to the hospital at a certain point in time. When Dr. Lucy said, after he dropped her from the balcony, her liver was lacerated, her kidney was lacerated, she suffered brain damage. Dr. Lucy said, had she been right outside the OR, the operating room, he doubts she would have survived with those severe injuries. So his act of strangulation is a contributing factor to Amie's cause of death. Then that's it. He caused the death. Him dropping over the balcony, that's the cause of death. You don't have to question anything about what time did they get to the hospital or anywhere else. He's caused her death. He has been a substantial factor in causing her death. Malice aforethought. There are two types. There's express and implied. So all murder starts off with the second degree. Express malice just means an intent to kill. And, sometimes defense counsel make it seem like, well, how do you know what was in his head? Well, circumstantial evidence. Have you ever heard the term actions speak louder than words? His actions tell you more about his intent than any words that defense counsel are arguing or asking their questions of the witnesses. Lethal dose of nicotine. That does not just happen out of nowhere. That does not land on his lap. He has to go get that. He has to go obtain that. It's a poison that if you inject it into someone, it may not be detected unless they're looking for it. So it's your choice of weapon to kill. This is worse than a gun. You got to go somewhere to go get this stuff. Her markings on her neck, strangulation. He's actually using his own hands to snuff the life out of her. That's a lot of anger. That's a lot of hate to do something like that. And he knows it's a 3-story balcony. And I do hope she was unconscious. And she did not experience that. But he knows when he's doing that he's going to kill her. He's going to finish her off. So that's an intent to kill. You can infer from the facts his intent to kill. There's implied malice. It's intentionally committing an act. The natural consequence of the act were dangerous to human life. Knew that the act was dangerous. Deliberately acted with a conscious disregard to human life. Sometimes I use an example. If someone dislikes someone, or they believe that no one's home, and they fire shots into the home, but they don't know if anyone's there. They're like, I'm not intending to kill anyone, but I want to send a message to these people that I don't like, and they fire a whole bunch of shots into that house. Well, that's an act that's dangerous to human life. It's conscious disregard for human life, because you should know that someone may be in that house. There may be a child, there may be someone, and even though you're not intending to kill anyone, someone could be hurt and killed. That's a conscious disregard for human life. That would be an example of implied malice. Not in this case. In this case, for you to find second-degree murder under implied malice, you would have to ignore the fact that he brought a lethal dose of nicotine and that he dropped it from the balcony. You would have to ignore those facts. But you're not going to do that. This is not second-degree murder, but we'll get to first in a second. All right, to get to second-degree murder, some of you may think, oh, this is intent to kill. He brought the lethal dose of nicotine, he strangled her, he threw her over the balcony. Some of you may say, and I'm not the facts, this is intent to kill, express malice. So once you're in express malice and intent to kill, because he breaks in, he waits for her. He has a lethal dose of nicotine. He strangles her. He drops her over the balcony. Then you have to ask yourself, is it willful, deliberate, and premeditated? That gets you to first-degree murder. Another theory is lying in wait, and I'll explain that to you. That gets you to first-degree murder. So either one of these theories proves first-degree murder. So let's go through them. Deliberate and premeditated. Willful means intentional. It means there wasn't an accident. Like, I'm not accidentally strangling her. I didn't accidentally have this nicotine on me. I didn't accidentally drop her over the balcony. Deliberate, formed by careful thought and weighing of consideration for and against the course of action. We're talking about a 41-year-old man, computer programmer. He knows what he's doing. He planned this. He chose Valentine's Day to do this to her, to end her life. He knows what the consequences are if he does this. He knows. He knows he's going to go to jail for the rest of his life if he kills her. This is not a child. This is not someone that doesn't understand what the consequences are. Premeditated, considered beforehand. Before he goes over there, he knows what the consequences will be. He knows what he's doing. That's all you need for premeditation deliberation. You consider before, you know the consequences of your actions, and you still go for it. There's no exact measure of time. His is well planned. It's methodical. This is not like some person sees someone they don't like, takes out a gun and goes boom, boom, boom. That would be an intent to kill, by the way. And that could also be premeditated and deliberate. You have the gun, you aim, you make sure you hit a vital part, and you fire multiple shots. That's premeditated and deliberate. So you don't need a long time. As long as you had enough time to think about what you're doing, think about what the consequences are going to be, and you decide, this is not an accident, I'm going to do it. A cool, calculated decision to kill can be reached quickly. The test is the extent of the reflection, not the length of the time. So here, we have it is so planned out. How he has to weaponize himself with that nicotine, how he has to get gloves, how he has to find her house. So he found her phone, and then he had to find where she lived. Then he had to figure out how to get up there. He got caught off guard. Those Ring cameras were installed a week before he did this. And from the video, the way he covers that up, it doesn't look like he was expecting those Ring cameras to be there. Lying in wait. This is another way to get to first-degree murder. The defendant murdered by lying in wait if he concealed his purpose from the victim. Amie didn't know what was waiting for her at her home. He waited and watched for an opportunity to act. He waited 3 to 4 hours for her in that house, in her sanctuary, with that lethal dose of nicotine. Then, from a position of advantage, he intended to and did it make a surprise attack on the victim? Absolutely. Can you imagine the moment after Amie texts her friend about sending the photos at 1:02 a.m.? She still has to get out of her car. She has to unlock that gate. She has to walk to that front door, unlock her front door. She misses that he has broken the French doors. She doesn't think, like no one would think, that there's someone waiting for you, intending to not only cause you harm, but to kill you, who has that poison there waiting for you. So now she has to walk upstairs. And in that moment, she's carefree. Send me the pictures. We had a great night. She walks up, and it's difficult to say what happened up there on the 3rd floor. She may have placed her bag in the bedroom, dropped her phone on the bed, then walked over to the TV room, and in those closets or what have you, in that dark room at that moment, this is her surprise. The ex-boyfriend who's been trying to force himself onto her life, the ex-boyfriend she got a restraining order against 12 years ago. And so that moment must have been horrific, must have been terrifying. In that moment, she knew, based on the email that she wrote, that he intended to cause her harm. She knew what was going to happen in that moment. She knew she was in the fight of her life. A fight that she would not win. So, some of you may think, that's lying in wait. He killed her and caught her off guard. That's lying in wait murder. That's first degree. Some of you may think, all that planning, all that workup, that's premeditated, deliberate. He did both. And it doesn't matter which one you decide gets you to first degree. It's first degree murder. Then as to count 1 murder, if you find that count 1 murders of the first degree, there's a special circumstance. And the law believes there's certain murders, the way you commit them, there should be more punishment for that. There's different special circumstances in the law. You kill multiple people, you torture them, there's different types. In this case, it's lying in wait, and it has one more element than what gets you to first degree, and I'll show you right now. The defendant intentionally killed the victim, and the defendant committed the murder while lying in wait. What does lying in wait mean for this particular instruction? The defendant concealed his purpose from the victim. That's straightforward. The defendant waited and watched for an opportunity to act. He's waiting in her house. The defendant then made a surprise attack on the victim from a place of advantage. But that just means he's there, she doesn't know he's going to be there, and that's an advantage. And here's the extra element that you didn't have for first degree. The defendant intended to kill the victim by taking the victim by surprise. So when he broke in there and he waited, he intended to kill her. The intent was not just to harm her, not to talk to her, not with that lethal dose, not with him keeping the gloves on the whole time, not with whatever that rope thing he had around his waistband, not with him not covering his face and would be identified by Amie Harwick. So this special circumstance is true. So the elements of murder, a human being was killed, with malice aforethought, that gets you to second degree murder. What gets you to first degree murder is if it was willful, deliberate, and premeditated, or if it's lying in wait. And what gets you to the special circumstance is that specific lying in wait instruction. Okay? Right to self-defense may not be contrived. The defendant cannot claim, well, when I broke in, all of a sudden she starts attacking me. Can you imagine? Like, someone breaks into your home. If someone breaks into your home, you have a right to defend yourself. You have the right to beat them. He can't claim, hey, she was attacking me, so I had to defend myself. The right to self-defense, a person does not have the right to self-defense if he provokes a fight or quarrel with the intent to create an excuse for use of force. So get that, let's set that straight. Now the defense is asking, or may ask you, may argue to you, voluntary manslaughter. This is not even in the ballpark in this case, and I'll tell you why. That means the defendant was provoked by Amie. As a result, the defendant acted rashly and under the influence of intense emotions which obscured his reasoning or judgment. And the provocation would have caused a person of average disposition to act rashly and without due deliberation, that is, from passion rather than judgment. Remember, the key word, a person of average disposition. The instruction actually tells you the defendant is not allowed to set up his own standard of conduct. Well, that's the way I act. I act impulsive and emotional. No, that's not the standard. Your very first jury instruction reads, if you look at towards the bottom of instruction 200, it reads, some of the instructions may not apply depending on your findings about the facts of this case. This instruction, given the facts of the case, will not apply for you. And here's why. Blocking someone is not reasonable provocation. Do you think that's reasonable provocation? If you block someone, they get to kill you? A person of average disposition would not try to kill Amie because she would not talk to him or because she would defend herself in her home.
Objection, Your Honor. It's a misstatement of heat of passion to say that a person of average disposition would be inclined to kill. That is not the standard for heat of passion.
Well, that's his interpretation of it, so the court will allow it.
Yes. And you can read the instruction. And that is, a person of average disposition, and I think counsel misread what I wrote up there. A person of average disposition would not try to kill Amie because she would not talk to him. Okay? Or because she would defend herself in her home. That would not happen. Burglary. This is very straightforward. Like the evidence in this case, it is very, very straightforward for you, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant entered an inhabited house, and when the defendant entered the house, he intended to commit murder. So when he's breaking in, and he has that syringe, and he's gloved up, and he's covering cameras, his intent is to kill her. And the moment he breaks there, and by the way, his intent remains the same throughout his stay in that house and everything he does there. But the burglary is completed once he's inside. He doesn't have to do anything else. For burglary, you don't have to commit the crime as long as you enter with that intent. Degrees of burglary. Very straightforward. He broke into her house. Breaking into someone's house, that elevates it to first degree burglary. This is not like breaking into a commercial establishment or a store. The house is where someone lives. So how does the evidence show you his intent to kill? It's not just that moment where he's strangling her. It's not just that moment when he's dropping her over the balcony. His intent to kill, you could get that from all the circumstances in this case, before the murder, during the murder, and after the murder. They all show his intent. So let's talk about before the murder. What's he doing? How's he acting that's telling you that he has an intent to kill? Well, we know they dated for about 1.5 years. 2012, she gets a restraining order against him. Stay away. Cuts off all ties with him. She lives on her life. She obtains a doctorate degree. She becomes a therapist. She is cared for and loved by her friends. And then this happens, January 16, 2020. It's just sheer bad luck. That she goes to a conference there on Wednesday, and then by Thursday, she's excited to go to this award show. She doesn't expect him to be there. He doesn't expect her to be there. And for a few seconds before she sees him, everything was okay in the world for her. But then you get these statements. You ruined my life, bitch. You know, the defense kept examining Hernando about this. He said, I testified, I heard that. I heard the tail end. Yes, they told me that he said that, but I also heard part of it. That's his testimony. By the way, is that something, you know, the whole you ruined my life, is that so different than the horror files and accessing them in 2019? Aspen Jamison said she was in the middle of a conversation with Amie and the defendant just barged right in between them, like she didn't exist. Because it's all about him. He's the one that feels entitled. I gotta be heard. That he had an angry tone. That's what she described his tone, angry. He said something to the effect, you fucking ruined my life. Does that sound like love? Or does that sound like anger and hate now? Well, Amie writes an email to herself later that morning. And you'll have it, and you can read it to yourself. And it's coming in for the state of mind. What her state of mind was of fearing the defendant. She would have never consented to him breaking into her home. She would have never consented to him just waiting there for her. Look what she says in her own words, the last paragraph of that email. I'm pretty nervous that I'm more on his radar now. It terrifies me that he's been obsessed for me for 9 years, thinks about me every day, can't move on, cries, and throws tantrums in this way. He's focused on harming me. He is focused on harming me. However, I'm hoping that the interaction and the listening and giving him time may cause a neutralization of his anger towards me. Is she describing it as his sadness towards me? No. She's afraid because she can see the anger in him. And she dated him, and she got a restraining order against him. And she describes whatever's happening at that ex-biz as tantrums and anger towards her. Not this debilitating depression that the defense argued to you during opening statements. Defendant begins to stalk Amie. And I'm not meaning this in the legal word, I'm just in general. He finds her phone on the internet. He will then find her house where she lives. He will then go to her house and break into her house. That's what I mean by that. January 17th, the day after the ex-biz, I interneted your phone. Her state of mind is she's afraid, and now this defendant, without permission, found her phone on the internet and is texting her. She has not called him since the breakup. Now he's forcing himself into her life. Why does the defense bring up that she may have Googled him in 2019? If she got a restraining order against him, and this is someone she's concerned about, why wouldn't she at some point try to figure out where this person is? Doesn't mean she reached out, called them, interacted with him. You have evidence that she didn't interact with him, she never called them. She tells them, basically in that last text message that she sends him, respect me, let's respect each other, and let's move on. So it's almost like she's pleading, please respect that I don't want to be in contact with you. But he doesn't respect her. The next day, she text messages The same day, she text messages Dr. Fernando Chavez. Gareth found my phone number online, messaged me. I told him I didn't want to talk and wished him the best, but his response was still obsessive scary. Handyman comes tomorrow for more locks for my windows and order pepper spray. Can you imagine? She has to go through all that. Like, she's living her life, and now she's got to go get a handyman to secure locks. She has to go out of her way to go get pepper spray because she doesn't know what's going to happen to her. Amie texts, thanks. I set a boundary over text, and I'm not responding after that. He keeps texting me and sounds unstable. Defendant does not respect Amie. It's all about his feelings, his emotions. He continues to send manipulative text messages at 2 p.m. and at 6:45. You know those text messages where he's groveling or asking her, let's talk, can we talk? That's manipulation. It's a 41-year-old man trying to force his way, in a nice way at first, back into her life, but it's not working. And she's going to cut him off. Amie does not have a duty to give him a hug, doesn't have a duty to respond. She has every right to cut off someone that acts the way he acts. Saturday, January 18, 2020. And he leaves a voicemail message, crying, trying to force himself back into her. This is all manipulation. This is all tantrums. She increases home security, new locks, and brings security cameras. I'm sorry, Nest security cameras. Sunday, she blocks him. Now you're done. You're cut off. You're not going to have access to me. And that is what triggers a lot of these events when he's completely cut off. He can no longer grovel to her. He can no longer leave voicemail messages to her, leave text messages to her. Texas Grace Stanley. I blocked him through text message, but because of his level of obsession, and I definitely don't think I'm in the clear, I have pepper spray at the house now. My roommate is on alert. I'm upping my home security cameras. Can you imagine living like that? Like, you have to do all that just to live? And so now the defendant is plotting against her. Now he has no access to her. Finds her phone in January. She's blocked. This is premeditated and deliberate. When we talk about premeditation and deliberation, he finds her home and obtains a poison to kill Amie. And he selects a poison where he could get away with it, right? He injects her. She may go into seizures. She may vomit. They would have to see the needle mark to even try to test for that poison. And you know, he doesn't smoke. You hear that in the jail conversation when they say, oh, but you don't even smoke. He goes out of his way to get this pure nicotine. And he picks Valentine's Day. Why did he pick Valentine's Day? Well, Valentine's Day is a day where Amie, who's social, who has friends, would probably be out. She's either with a date or she's out with friends, which is what happened. And she is out with friends. And these are the last moments of her life when she was happy. You know, the defense in their opening statement mentioned there's going to be a witness, Elmira Menasaka, who's going to come in and say that he was depressed and all this stuff. You didn't hear any one of her or any friend come here and say he was so debilitated and depressed. And so what if he was? Does that mean you get to break in and kill someone?
Objection, Your Honor. Based on reports for these rulings, this isn't a proper argument.
Okay. Defendant's actions speak louder than defense counsel's words about what happened in this case. Look what he's doing 2 hours before he breaks in. He's texting Natasha Polson. This is 2 hours before he breaks in. This is all a cover-up. This is like sending messages to different women to show that life is okay. I'm not planning to kill anyone. Talking to this woman, I'm talking to that woman. And his text at 10 p.m. Oh, that's totally fine. That's totally fine, busy woman. I'm good. Just also trying to get everything under the sun done with whatever you want to call that emoji, happy face or what have you. That's 2 hours before he's going to break into her home. Also, what does his intent tell you about what happened after he drops her over the balcony? Angelique Judice, like within 10, 11 hours after the murder, he's setting up a date with her. What does that tell you about what he's thinking? And does he care that Amie's dying? No, he doesn't care, because it's all about him. Did I get away with it? Did she get what I believe she deserved for blocking me out of her life? That is cold. That is cold-blooded. So, pursuant to his plan, he comes up from the empty lot from behind, and he gets caught off guard by these ring cameras. And he covers them up. Does that sound to you like someone that just wants to talk to someone? Covering up cameras like that. Holding them down, and then they shut down. What's that thing around his waist? That white thing on the outside of the shorts. That looks like rope or something else that you could use to hold her down and inject her with that poison. If you want to talk to someone, well, why don't you just leave a note? I mean, that's kind of, you're going to freak her out. You leave a note, hey, I found your house, can we talk? He didn't do that. He didn't wait outside her home and say, hey, I'm here, which would have been horrible in itself. He didn't do that. He chose to wear gloves, have this rope around his waist, a bag on his hands, cover up cameras. He's not going there to talk. He's on a mission. You have Michael Herman, the roommate. Earlier, before the screams, he doesn't know exactly when, but earlier he hears like something like a dish breaking. Well, that's the defendant breaking into those French doors. He's committed. He's breaking in. I mean, that takes a lot for someone to decide, I'm going to go into someone's home without their permission. I'm just going to break this glass and go inside. And he leaves blood on the French doors and on the floor. That's his DNA. 1 out of septillion, that's his blood. And he has injuries consistent with kicking in that glass, breaking in there. Scratches. Not only bruises on the knees from landing on his knees when he's fleeing, but he has these fresh scratches. And he's wearing shorts, by the way, when he breaks in. And when he breaks in, when he breaks that threshold of her home, on his person, he has that lethal dose of nicotine. That's when the burglary is completed at that point. Let's talk about this lethal dose of nicotine. So we know defendant doesn't smoke based on the jail conversation. LAPD criminals could not confirm what that was, right? They couldn't confirm that that was nicotine. Dr. Bradley from the FBI, it was sent to the FBI, they were able to confirm that it was nicotine. Dr. Wu confirmed that it was 86.9% pure nicotine, a poison. Dr. Benowitz testified and said, that would have been a lethal dose that had been injected into Amie Harwick, and difficult to detect, because as you see, they're not testing for this poison. They're not screening for this poison. Dr. Lucy, the H screen, the homicide screen used by LA, would not have detected nicotine. He would have to have requested it. There's a lot that went into getting to deciding to get this particular poison. This shows that his intent to kill when he breaks in and when he's lying in wait at her home. So while he's inside her home, with that nicotine waiting for her to show up, she's ending her night with her friends. And do you remember Rebecca Jalad describing how Amie loved tea? And they end their night, and at about 12:30 a.m., she's about to leave, and Amie does not know what's in store for her at home. She's being caught off guard and by surprise, which is why that special cert is significant. The way you kill someone by catching them completely off guard, they don't know what's coming. She gets to her home at about 1:01, parks her car, texts her friend at about 1:02, Sarah Rollins, send me the pics on the green couch. Amie will never get to see that picture of her and her friend on the green couch because by the time it's sent at 2:05, she's unconscious on the floor, seizing. Here's why this is so quick. 1:02 a.m. is the text, right? 1:08 a.m., that's when Michael Herman is triggering the neighbor's Ring camera. That is 6 minutes. But it's much shorter than that, the time that the defendant immediately attacked Amie. Because you gotta take into consideration, it's less than 6 minutes. Amie had to walk upstairs. She had to open the gate, do all that, get upstairs. That takes time. Michael woke up to an ongoing assault. He didn't the assault started when he woke up. The assault woke him up, the screams. So it was already going on. It takes Michael time to get from the backyard, go around the house, climb the gate, until he gets to the neighbor's house and triggers it at 1:08. So the period of time where the defendant's attacking her is immediate. It's it's less than 4 minutes. So there's no talking, there's no discussion. She gets surprised by him, she's scared, and he attacks her. Defendant's actions during the murder tell you about his intent to kill also. So we talked about before the murder, now during the murder. Let's see what his actions tell you. Well, he knows he's bigger than her. He didn't show up to someone's house because he thought he could get a challenge. He knew he was bigger and stronger than her, and he was muscular. So at 1:02 a.m., he's up there waiting for her. And he's been there for 3 to 4 hours with that lethal dose of nicotine. He doesn't remove the gloves, he keeps them on. And he does not leave. Why didn't he leave? If he just wanted to talk to her and changed his mind, why not leave? No, because his intent is to kill her. He's angry, he feels rejected. He knew what the plan was. That nicotine was for a purpose. He's gloved up so he doesn't leave fingerprints. He catches Amie by surprise immediately, and he wants Amie to know who's killing her. He's not wearing a mask. He's not wearing like a ski mask or anything like that. He knows she's going to be able to see who's killing her, and he wants her to know what happens when you reject him. Michael Herman yells out, "Leave her alone, motherfucker." And so at that point, the defendant knows either he's going to get caught or someone's going to come up and intervene in his plan. By the way, the term "this is a struggle," this is not a struggle. This is an assault. This is not like two people that can fight each other, that are equally matched. This is someone that's catching the other person off guard. And look at all her wounds, assaultive wounds. She even had defensive wounds. Dr. Lucy said she had bruises on her forearms trying to block blows, consistent with trying to block blows. Amie fought back. She fought to live. She wanted to live. She scratched him. She got his DNA under her fingernails. She knew she was in for the fight of her life, and she was trying. But can you imagine the anger this defendant has as he's punching her, hitting her? You think he's holding back? He's not holding back. Look at those injuries that Dr. Lucy described to her face. Focal injuries, not injuries that you would get in the face from landing on the pavement. These are smaller focal injuries consistent with getting punched. So you have a 230-pound, 6'4" guy punching you in the face who's angry. But she's fighting back and she's marking him too. Right? Michael Herman wakes up to blood-curdling screams. And the defense cross-examined him, and this is her roommate. He wanted to help as much as he could. He wanted to tell the truth. He's not here to hide evidence. He's not here to make up stuff against anyone. This is a traumatic experience. He didn't know who was up there, or if he ran up there, he didn't know if the individual would have a gun or he would get killed. And if he got killed, then you would never hear from Michael Herman. You would never hear about him hearing a dish crash beforehand, about her screams, about her body being thrown to the ground. Had he died, you would never hear any of that. He immediately calls 911 and says, "My friend is being attacked, thrown to the ground." There it is. Why do we have to question, well, you didn't say this on this date, and 5 days later you said this? People are not machines, they're not recorders, and sometimes witnesses may remember, something may jog their memory and they can remember one more fact. It's up to you to decide, did he make up any facts? On February 17th, he left a voicemail message for the detectives, heard a plane crash earlier in the evening. This is before any of that LA article that defense counsel questioned him. That defense counsel questioned Detective Masterson about. You know what's interesting? They didn't ask Michael Herman, "Hey, Michael Herman, let's be fair about this. Here's this LA Times article. Did you ever read that before calling the detectives and telling them on February 20th that she got choked?" Did they confront him with that to see what his answer would be? No. They waited to ask Detective Masterson. He would not know how to answer Michael Herman's question. Don't be distracted, ladies and gentlemen. Focus on the evidence in this case. Defendant is wearing gloves. I'm going to take this off. Dr. Lucy said manual strangulation is a contributing factor to her cause of death. Remember the cause of death? This is a cause of her death. 15 to 20 seconds, you could render someone unconscious. He also said, when he was asked, well, did he strangle her with 2 hands or with 1 hand? He couldn't tell you because he said, typically, you will be able to tell it's 2 hands because the nails will be embedded into the neck, and then you could tell it's 2 hands. Well, when you're prepared and you're wearing gloves, you're not going to leave those fingernails. Hey, motherfucker, leave her alone. He needs to get out. Defendant needs to leave because he wants to live. He wants to get away with this. He doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want to die. He wants to live. He wants to get away with it. He doesn't want to be identified. He wants the life he's living. So at this point, according to Dr. Lucy, Amie was beaten and she's fatigued. She's not this, as the defense presented during opening, this athletic person that all of a sudden the defendant lets her go and then she on her own decides, the way I'm going to get away from this is I'm going to climb on the outside of the balcony after being strangled. I'm going to have the strength to do that. It's ridiculous. Then they show this photo of her from over a year ago on the balcony where she's posing. Completely different situation. It has nothing to do with someone being attacked. It's disrespectful. That photo has nothing to do with this situation. If Amie lives, you know this. You know that if Amie lives, she's seen his face, and this defendant's life is over. She will identify him to the police, and his life is done. He does not want that, and he's going to kill her to make sure that she does not tell anyone what he did to her. And so, her fatigued body, her beaten body, is dragged over to the balcony, and there's a blood smear there. And I can't, remember when we told you we can't always prove every single thing. That's not the point. Either he got it from his glove, or part of her body, her face that was bleeding, got the blood on there. But you know, in trying to drop her over the balcony, he dropped that syringe. So when he's lifting her over the balcony, he knows how high that is. It's 21 feet. He knows what he's doing. He's going to finish her off. She will not be able to identify him. And that's pure concrete down there. Anyone would know. Even a child would know if I dropped this person, they could die here. But he's not a child. Dr. Lucy, what did Dr. Lucy say? Doubt she would have survived if right outside the OR. Given the liver laceration, the kidney laceration, the brain damage, it wouldn't have mattered. Injuries to the face are focal, meaning she's being punched. Defending pressing on her right shoulder. I don't know if any of you caught this, but there's an injury that where it leaves like a white circle here. There's pressing, and there's pressing on the back. So that's the defendant attacking her with his big hand. Manual strangulation, we already talked about that. Gloves prevents from knowing if it's two hands, but that's the point of gloves. The reason he got gloves is to cover up the crime. He doesn't want to leave fingerprints. He doesn't want to leave anything that's related to him. He wants to get away with this murder. And you know, then Dr. Lucy is cross-examined by defense counsel, and she's asking, well, didn't you tell me and this Aaron Mintz something else? And he says no. And you know what happens after that? There's no Aaron Mintz that comes here and says he said something else. There's none of that. Dr. Lucy continued with his testimony. He said 15 to 20 seconds would render someone unconscious. Here are the fall injuries. Pelvic fractures. The amount of force when he drops her, it causes those severe pelvic fractures. Those are not caused by kicking someone or any other, that's caused by the impact of being dropped. So she's being dropped on her buttock area. Lacerations to the liver, it's that force of hitting the concrete that sends that shock and lacerates the liver. Lacerations to the kidney. The right scapula, there's a fracture on it. It takes a lot of force for that to happen, he said. The right middle of the head, brain damage. A lot of the right side damage. No injuries to the back. She didn't land on her back. She wasn't holding on to some rail and then landed on her back. His opinion, this is a homicide, not an accident. That's his opinion after evaluating her injuries. This is consistent with defendant picking up Amie and dropping her over the balcony and her landing on her buttock area, shattering the pelvis, damaging the liver and the kidney, and then the right side, causing the damage to the right shoulder and the top of the back head. And then she just falls flat after that on her face. Not that she hit the face, because had she hit her face first, there would have been severe fractures, which there were not. The defense during their opening said, what you're going to hear from Bob Malik, who places her on these 3D stills holding on to the railing with one foot on the awning, speculating that whatever damage was in that awning, she caused it. I mean, how do you get to that? How do you prove that that was not there before this all happened? And how does she do a crunch after being beaten to hold that position? What we do know is our 3D expert created these 3D to help you understand the relationship of all these buildings and location of evidence. And he said he took a measurement from the ground to the floor of the balcony, and that's at 17 feet and 7 inches, and that report that he read from Malik was off by almost 3 feet for that distance. Don't speculate about what Mr. Malik would have testified. He didn't testify. They didn't call him. They said they were going to call him, but they didn't call him. So don't let that distract you from the actual evidence in this case. I'm almost done, ladies and gentlemen. I know you have this look like, how much more? There's not that much more, I think. All right, the syringe, he drops into the balcony. He didn't know he dropped it. Had he known that he dropped that syringe, he would not have left that there. He would have picked that up. In all that commotion and dropping her over the balcony, that fell out of his person. Either he was holding it or it fell out, it doesn't matter. He left that behind. Because now he knows that there's someone, a witness downstairs, Michael Herman, who's yelling. He has to end her life quickly because he has to get out. Because if Michael Herman is yelling, she's yelling, guess who else may hear this? The neighbors may hear this. So what are defendant's actions after he's done this, after he dropped her to her death? Does it show that he's depressed, upset, or does it show, no, he wanted to kill her? That was his whole intent. Well, let's see. The very first thing he does, Amie's there. You saw the body-worn video. How do you leave a human being in that condition and not try to help? How do you not help her? If you loved her at any point, why not help her then? Why not try to call 911 so the ambulance can come? Because it's not love. It's hate and anger now. So he runs through the kitchen door, runs right by her. And I'm going to ask you, look at the photos of her body near the area where he would have to run by. It is so close. It's like right here. And so she, at this point, is in all likelihood unconscious. So much damage to her neck from the strangulation that it's difficult for her to breathe. And he renders no aid. Instead, he thinks about himself. He thinks about his survival, and he just runs right by her, breaks that arm of that statue, jumps over the fence, and leaves her to die. That's more of an intent to kill. He just leaves her to die. And he's still wearing the gloves. Paramedic Turner, who showed up and was one of the first individuals to see her, says Amie was looking and appearing lifeless. And I cited the page in the transcript. Just want to get my language right on this. Amie was unconscious. She was not able to breathe on her own. A blood pressure of 60 is not sustainable for life. This is what defendant did to her. Her condition never improved while he was there with her. Never improved. So what's defendant doing after he leaves Amie to die? He texts us. 46 minutes later, he text messages Natasha Paulson. Haha, that's funny. I guess he felt he needed to respond to that text message at that point, 46 minutes after dropping Amie to her death. He doesn't care about Amie. He doesn't care about her life. What he's doing, he's covering up his tracks, acting like he was not the guy that was there, like everything's normal for him. Cold-blooded. A few hours later, he's going to be communicating with his Tinder date that he had from before, Angelique G. Morning, sunshine. This is at 10 a.m., about 10 hours after he's dropped her from the balcony and seen her body there. What do you think about that? 10 hours after leaving Amie to die. All he's doing is covering up. And she sees the black eye, and he tells her, from what you remember, well, I got that shaving. And at 4:30 p.m., they spent all this time together. So here he's killed his ex-girlfriend. And he's with this other lady, spending time with her. And then he's going to take her home in his Lexus. And then that's when he gets arrested. Because everyone has pointed to the finger to the person that Amie said, if anything happens to me, Gareth Pursehouse did it. She knew. They take photographs of his scratches, his bruises. Some of them caused when he tried to flee, some of them when he broke into her house, and some of them where Amie marked them, where she fought back. At his home, you have these white tennis shoes. You have these shorts with the white stripes that look like the shorts on the camera. You have the gloves that have black at the bottom. Those may or may not be the gloves, but they look like that. What you also have at his home, they find this syringe with some yellow liquid, which is the same brand as the syringe from Amie's balcony. On his phone, it's a computer programmer, as we know, there are no text messages. There's no call log. There are no contacts. That's different than the data that you obtained from Amie's, where you had all that information, all the text messages, including his text messages to her. And look at two weeks later. I mean, that's his attitude. There's no remorse in that conversation. His intent was always to kill. And in a way, he killed the person that was causing him this pain, the person that rejected him.
I mean, I saw people that I don't know were saying shit about me in the media, and people that I haven't talked to in a long time saying the same thing. Yeah, I don't know her. I've never met her. Yeah. I don't know. I didn't think she knew Amie, but she had inserted herself in her microphone. Yeah, I thought that was weird. Like, who is that person? Yeah.
And Amie's name comes up. Is there anything, wow, sorry, life lost? None of that.
So you say you're not getting that? Correct. Ever. Is that what you're trying to say? Yes. Okay. I've seen what's coming at me, and not good. I'm not getting it. Super fun.
That's his attitude, not some depressive state, no remorse, doesn't care about Amie. So, I already told you the elements of murder. You get the second degree, willful, deliberate, premeditated, lying in wait. First degree, the special circs of lying in wait. And we've already discussed how you get to premeditation, deliberation, and the special circs of lying in wait. I'm going to end it with this slide. This is the reasonable doubt. It's the definition of reasonable doubt. I want to start off with what it is not. This is my last slide. It's not beyond all possible doubt, because anyone could play that game. Or is this possible? Is that possible? No. It's not beyond a possible doubt. It is not beyond an imaginary doubt. It's not a juror saying, well, I can imagine this and that. No. It's not a percentage. Did the evidence show this by 90%, 70%? No, it's not a percentage. It's not beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's a movie term. You don't even get that in the law. It's not based on a hunch. It's not a juror saying, well, you know what? I know the evidence is overwhelming. It shows he did it. It shows he planned it. It shows he had the motive to kill her. But I got a hunch that I missed something. It's not a hunch. It's a juror carefully looking at all the evidence. It is reasonable. That's the key word. It is a reasonable doubt. And the 12 of you get together and you'll know what reasonable is. It's based on the entire consideration and comparison of all the evidence. That means a juror doesn't isolate evidence. Oh, this evidence, there was issues with it. No, you look at the entire case. And what does looking at the entire case show you about his guilt? It's an abiding conviction of the truth of the charge. What does that mean? That means the jurors here would say, look, if they presented the same evidence that they presented in this trial during the 30 or so days we were here, if they presented it to me a month from now, I vote guilty on first-degree murder and the special search. And if they show me the same evidence, 20 years from now, the same evidence, same defense, same arguments from the people, and same evidence, 20 years from now, based on the same evidence, I would vote the same way. It's an abiding conviction for the truth of the charge. Ladies and gentlemen, Amie Harwick lost her life. She had a life to live. She did all she could. She did everything right. This defendant planned to kill her. We're asking you to hold him accountable based on the evidence in the law, hold him accountable for first-degree murder, find him guilty of that crime, and find the special circumstance of lying in wait when he committed this murder to be true. Hold him accountable for all his actions. Don't minimize what he did. Don't ignore everything he did. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I want to, before I get into everything, I just want to take an opportunity to thank you all sincerely on behalf of the defense team, because of the week we were dark with illnesses, and you've all been so patient and so attentive and so willing to stick with us. We're all, both sides, extremely appreciative of that, so thank you for that. This case boils down to a very simple question. Why did Gareth Pursehouse go to 2086 Mount Street on February 14th, 2020? Whoops, already technical problem.
I have so much I need to say. Please give me a chance to defend it so I can explain it. Please.
The answer is clear. He went there because he was desperate to talk to Amie Harwick. Why did he need to speak to her so desperately? Well, you've heard a lot of evidence in this case. You've had a chance to see Amie Harwick's email to herself describing her encounter with Mr. Pursehouse at the XBiz Awards. You've had an opportunity to hear from many witnesses who Amie told about the encounter and included details she hadn't included in her email. You had an opportunity to see Gareth Purshouse's text messages to Amie Harwick. All of this paints an undeniable picture of the extreme pain Mr. Pursehouse, Gareth Pursehouse, was experiencing after his breakup with Amie Harwick back in 2012. And he struggled in all those intervening years to deal with the daily pain that he described to her in those text messages. It was a struggle he tried to control. He made efforts to get his equilibrium, and he managed to. He dated other women. He was successful in his career, and he had a life, a good life. He had no shortage of romance in his life, but it fell short in his estimation. It was nothing compared to the relationship he had with Amie Harwick. And he described it to her. He said that he shared everything with her during their relationship. And they forged a deep intimacy, one that he couldn't replicate with anybody else. So when Amie Harwick walked into the XBiz Awards on that fateful day in January, and he saw her for the first time in all those years, after the restraining order had expired years previously. And through no fault of his own, there she was. It landed like a sucker punch on him. And it literally brought him to his knees. He curled up in the fetal position in this crowded red carpet area in front of peers, co-workers, strangers. It was something he could not control. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something we cannot deny. All of the evidence in this case undeniably establishes that Gareth Pursehouse was suffering a great emotional upheaval, one that interfered with his thought process, one that focused him like a laser on getting relief from this unrelenting pain. And the only person he thought could help him, that could release him, was Amie Harwick. And why is that? Because when he saw her and she spoke to him, it was cathartic. He was able to let that facade open. The emotions he'd repressed for so long surfaced, and he cried some more. He was shaking. I mean, the descriptions that we've gotten from Amie Harwick and her friends establish a man in a crisis. The prosecution claims he was trying to force his way back into her life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. He was trying to cope with the fallout of Amie Harwick walking back into his life. He didn't ask for that. It was a chance encounter, and it left him reeling without a lifeline. The evidence in this case shows both an internal dialogue Mr. Pursehouse was going through, as well as how he externally presented to other people as a result of the manifestation of his emotional crisis. So I'm going to want to go through some of the evidence in this case that shows this state of mind Mr. Pursehouse was in. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this jury instruction. This is CalCrim 303, and this is very important because you've received a lot of state of mind evidence in this case. And it's very important you understand the limitations to the state of mind of Amie Harwick, because that evidence is only admitted for a limited purpose. So let me be clear on what that purpose is by first going through the instruction with you. During the trial, evidence of Amie Harwick's email to herself and statements to friends related to her fear of the defendant, Gareth Pursehouse, are being admitted for a limited purpose, to show her then state of mind that she was in fear of the defendant, that she would not have consented to him entering her home, and would not have consented to him lying in wait. You may not consider this evidence for, you may consider that evidence only for that purpose and for no other. So you cannot use this evidence in any way to decide whether or not Gareth Pursehouse intended her harm. All of her statements about her fear, how he might, in her mind, have intended her harm, those are not something you can consider in assessing Mr. Pursehouse's state of mind or his intentions. That being said, let's move on to Amie Harwick's email to herself. It might be a little hard to read, but I'm going to highlight certain parts of this. She describes, the first encounter, how Gareth came up behind her and started screaming. And then she describes how he started looking like he was going to cry. And he was breathing heavily and flailing his arms around. And she also makes a point of, that he's dysregulated in his eyes. That part is not highlighted. So she's describing a person whose emotions are taking over their physical body. He was sobbing. His head was in his hands. He couldn't sit up straight. His head was in his hands. He was hyperventilating. He was distorting his face up and shaking violently. He was shaking so hard he couldn't control it because of his emotions. He told me that he thinks about me every day, and every day he cries. He told me he lost his job when we broke up because he couldn't work. He told me that no matter what he did, he couldn't stop obsessing over me. He told me that I was a cheater and a liar because he thought we were still together when I believed we were broken up. So, Mr. Pursehouse also felt there had been, that Amie had cheated on him during the course of their relationship. And that was, back when they were together. And he recited text messages that she had sent from that time frame, back when they were together, about 9 years ago. He recited the date, who they were to, and exactly what was said word for word. He said he wasn't able to move on. But he's dated, but nobody with me. He said he thinks about me constantly, and he can't watch the TV shows that we watched together, hear the songs that we liked, or the names that we called each other, or even smell vanilla, or he has a panic attack. And all of that was before Amie Harwick walked back in his life. He's describing what his day-to-day life was like before that encounter at the XBiz Awards. Imagine what it must be like to go through your day-to-day activities carrying the burden of those emotions. Imagine how exhausting that must have been. Imagine how hard Mr. Pursehouse would have had to work to maintain the life he established, working as a programmer, having a savings of over $100,000, and trying to have a normal life, despite the heavy burden he was carrying day in and day out. Amie goes on to say, I actually did tell him I was sorry. Sorry that things ended so terribly. Sorry that I had to take the measure of getting the restraining order because I just didn't see any other option. She acknowledges their relationship ended terribly. It ended with a restraining order, meaning Mr. Pursehouse couldn't contact her, and he didn't, for all those years, after it even expired. After this conversation, he went back to take pictures, but he asked if they could speak later, and she told him yes. And you'll remember Hernando Chavez described when Mr. Pursehouse approached Amie while they were seated at their table inside the XBiz Awards ceremony. And he described how Mr. Pursehouse came over, knelt down next to Amie, and whispered in her ear. And then Amie turned to Hernando Chavez and said, I'm going to go talk to Gareth some more. So Amie goes on to explain that towards the end of the awards show, I sat with him off to the side again as he cried and shook. He was still crying. Later in the evening, he was still that emotionally devastated that he still was not able to control his crying and his shaking. He was able to sit up straight and have more of a conversation, and they were able to clarify some things. But he couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop hyperventilating. And he'd have a moment of clarity and then just start breaking down. He said he wakes up every day and cries on the floor. He says every day he wished I was in his life. Every day for all those years. And then she goes on to conclude, at the end of this conversation, I told him my friend Hernando was waiting for me, and I asked how he would like to end this conversation. He asked for a hug, and I told him that was not a good idea, and he started to cry. Eventually, he walked away, and then she makes a note of him walking away properly, and something about putting his hand up as he walked away. These excerpts and Amie Harwick's email to herself have important information in them. In these clips, we hear about Mr. Pursehouse regrets. His regrets about his relationship with Amie. But he did not have an opportunity to fully articulate himself that day. Why? Because he was in a very emotionally disturbed state. He was shaking, he was crying.
I'm going to object as to this is being admitted for other than the limited purpose of the victim's state of mind.
Sustained.
Without having an opportunity to fully express himself, Mr. Pursehouse reached out to Amie Harwick by text message. Oh, before we get to that, let's talk about Amie Harwick's description of Gareth to her friends. The prosecution made a point in their opening argument earlier today of saying this was a tantrum. But Marcy Mendoza made a point to say, no, that's not what Amie said, not a tantrum. She said he went crazy, he was erratic, he broke down. And Sarah Rowland said, Amie said he went a little crazy, he was triggered, he got into the fetal position on the ground, he was crying and reciting text messages. Now we can go on to Gareth's messages to Amie Harwick, which are very hard to see. So he starts, I interneted your number. Recognize it now that I see it, if I'm allowed to text. And then there's a series of the letter P, and Mr. Pursehouse tries to use humor, because this is an awkward, emotional situation. Yes, we shall all pee. And she responds, oh wow, my text was left open and I'm on a call, sorry. And smiley face. He says, so you're not really into talking about pee now. She says, I'm glad we had a chance to speak last night. It sounds like we both needed to express and hear some things from the other person. And he continues to joke, just sometimes pee, got it. I'm sometimes why. And then referring to her text, yeah, I needed it, still do. I slept well, almost an hour at 7 a.m. So he had a sleepless night. And I'm right now listening to a phone conference, literally about organizing psych articles for the rapists. Now, we're going to get to know Mr. Pursehouse's sense of humor. He likes to play wordplay, and if you put the rapists together into one word, it's the word therapists.
I'm going to object as soon as facts not in evidence.
That's your take on it. Doesn't mean that it means that, but it's correct that it means that if you put it together. But go ahead.
Thank you. She says, I think it was really good that we were able, let's see. He says, not sure if you're done because you said, how do we finish this now, last night? But if we can meet again, and she says, I think it was really good that we were able to speak last night. I'm sure there's a lot more that you want to process and say to me. So she realizes, yes, he didn't have a full opportunity to process everything, being so caught off guard that way. And that there were still things he wanted to say to her. But for Amie, that's not what she needed, and that's fine. And there's no blame to Amie for her choice or her setting of boundaries. No one contests that was within her right, and that was an appropriate thing for her to do. She says, I think that was a lot for both of us. I hope you were able to hear me last night when I said that I was sorry for anything that caused you suffering and that I forgive you for the things that you did to me. I think right now it's best to have some space, and I don't mean that in a negative way. The past is sad and triggering for both of us. I think we ended our talk last night well. We can be civil from a distance, respect each other, and move forward with our own lives. And Mr. Pursehouse responds, so you're still just gone, which is exactly my nightmare, and sadly what I expected. So you're still just gone, and it feels the same as when I wrote you that long list of what I would miss about you, and heard nothing back, just reaching out into the darkness, trying to stop falling. I wish I could do something more, but reaching out to you is a crippling action that I had actually contemplated several times over the past few months, just to say to you the word help. Admitting to you how hurt I am is so embarrassing and painful, which demolishes me even more because it used to be I told you every detail about myself, no matter what. So what he is saying here is that he needs help. He knew it before he saw her. He even thought about reaching out to her before he saw her, but he restrained himself. He did not. And he knows that this isn't right, that he shouldn't be in this emotional state. That's why he needs help. And that's why he's embarrassed that it's so painful, that he can't get past this. And it demolishes him to have to acknowledge this to her. He's not manipulating her. He's revealing his darkest secret to her. I don't know how busy you are, he says, and it truly scares me so much more than I can possibly convey to say this. But please don't vanish on me. Please, please don't let me go through that again. He's begging her, please don't vanish. He's begging her for a chance to talk to her. And when she doesn't respond, he leaves the voicemail message that we heard at the beginning of my statement. Gareth was consumed by emotions and in a crisis. All of these emotions that we've described are the exact hallmark types of emotions that prevent a person from deliberating when you look at the definition and the elements of first-degree murder. These are the terms Amie and her friends used to describe Gareth. Dysregulated, out of control, crying, breathing heavily, hyperventilating, shaking violently, obsessing, panic attacks, couldn't stop crying. I mean, everything that you go through, this shows a man in an emotional crisis. And then his own words, this is my nightmare. I'm reaching out into the darkness, trying to stop falling. Reaching out is a crippling action. Help. He's embarrassed. It's painful. He's demolished. And he's afraid. The intensity of his feelings frighten him. So of course they frightened Amie Harwick. Of course. Please don't let me go through that again. Don't just vanish. Please call me. Now, the prosecution wants to trivialize all of this. They want to pick it apart and take it out of context in a way to prevent you from using it as it's intended to be used to show Mr. Purshouse's state of mind, to show why he went to 2086 Mound, and to show that he was not thinking clearly. He was in a genuine emotional crisis. Now, those text messages that we looked at, I want to remind you that those text messages did not become available until late 2021. This case was filed in February of 2020. Gareth Purshouse's phone was immediately taken to that Orange County Regional Computer Forensic Lab to be examined. Amie Harwick's was not. It was simply brought to the LAPD. They couldn't open it because it was pass protected. And then, for some reason, the LAPD didn't even bother to go into that phone until after the preliminary hearing in late 2021. So when these charges were filed, when we had the preliminary hearing, we did not have the benefit of Mr. Purshouse's state of mind evidence.
Since that's not an evidence of what they had.
Sustained.
Well, the timeline speaks for itself, ladies and gentlemen. I can't remember exactly the word they used, but something to cover up his crime by engaging with Natasha Paulson and Angela G. But what they don't tell you, and what is obvious if you've paid attention to the evidence, is that Gareth Pursehouse was trying to resume his equilibrium when he reached out to Natasha Paulson and Angela G. and was trying to have relationships with them. He was trying to resume his normal life. But it was obvious he couldn't, because he showed up at her house still suffering under the emotions that he had described to her, that he had been suffering since they broke up. So after seeing Amie, Gareth tried to recover his fragile equilibrium, but he was consumed by his emotions. This was not an attempt for him to cover up a crime. How would that cover up a crime? Texting with somebody over, there's a huge gap in the text between Natasha Paulson and Gareth Pursehouse. It doesn't even look like an attempt to try to show he was engaged in anything other than being at her home with that time gap. There's no attempt to cover up where he was in those text messages. And reaching out to Angela G. on the day, February 15th, the day he ultimately was arrested, there's nothing unusual about that. He was sad, she said. She said she wanted to comfort him the way he comforted her when she was sad. And he suggested they go to a firing range, something they had never done. He knew she was somebody who was into guns, but for some reason on that day, he suggested they go to the firing range. The prosecution also claims that Gareth Pursehouse was reacting out of anger when he arrived at 2086 Mound, that he had this whole thing planned out, that he went there with the intention to kill Amie Harwick, that he went there with the intention to murder her. But where's the anger in those messages? He's supplicant towards her. He's asking, if I may. He's not aggressive with her. He's not saying he's entitled to anything. He's just telling her how vulnerable he is and how needy he is. Something that's difficult for him to do, but he did it. If he was angry at her for being blocked, his text messages being blocked, then why wouldn't that anger have surfaced all those years ago when she got a restraining order against him?
I'm going to object based on the court's ruling. As soon as that's found in evidence.
Overruled.
If he was so angry at her, wouldn't his anger have surfaced at the time when it was close to their breakup? Why wait all of these years if anger were his motivation? That doesn't make sense. And anger was not his motivation. If it had been, it would have surfaced before February 14th, 2020. The only anger he showed her at the XBiz Awards was anger about his perception of her hypocrisy. You'll remember that there was discussion about, why are you here? He kept asking her, why are you here? And Aspen Jameson said, from her it seemed that there had been an issue about Amie Harwick, disapproving of the porn industry. And Gareth was making an issue of that when he was asking her why she's here, because during their relationship, it had become an issue.
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
It was shocking to him to see Amie there, knowing that she had disapproved of the industry. The Amie he knew
I'm going to
disapproved.
facts not in evidence.
It does, counsel. So you can rephrase your statement or move on.
Thank you. Aspen Jameson said it seemed as though she disapproved of the porn industry. So Gareth Pursehouse' anger towards her about hypocrisy was directed towards that. Why would somebody who disapproved of the industry be at an industry event? This was the last place in the world he expected to see her. And that led to him being completely floored, literally floored, when he saw her there. Prosecution has introduced statements that Gareth Pursehouse made to his friends while he was in custody at one of the jail facilities. And I want to go through that with you. First, there's a jury instruction that tells you how to evaluate a defendant's statements. And it says it's up to you to decide how much importance to give the statements. And the prosecution is trying to claim that these statements to his friends are somehow an admission of guilt. So I want to put them in context so that you can make the determination of how much importance to give these statements. Let's see if this will work.
Oh, dear, man. How are you? Shitty. Hey, can you help my brother pack up my house, please?
Yeah, that's one of the things we were going to try to talk to you about and see what we can do to help on the outside.
Yeah, please do that. And, I mean, that's essentially it.
How do we know how to get...
So the first thing he says to his friends is, can you help my brother? My brother's going to need a lot of help. Can you help him pack up my house?
Oh, dear, man. How are you? I'm not getting out of here. I have court tomorrow, but just to postpone my initial trial. And my brother's gonna need a lot of help to get my stuff out. I got out on bail for a minute, but then I got brought right back in. So they took every penny I had in savings. So now I have 0 cents and actually put my brother in debt a little bit. So that's really fucked up. And I need Dave to give him the money he owes me.
I think
badly.
he's busy this week.
Okay, well at some point I need Dave to pay my brother the money he owes me, because I'm not working anymore. I mean that's essentially it, really. I hear there's a lot of news.
Yeah, you were all over the news, pal.
But
Yeah. All over. Is that your hair? I think I see your hair.
yeah, fucking. They put me on the wrong thing, so I'm leaning over. I can't reach up.
I saw your arm.
Yeah. God. Yeah. So my brother's gonna need a lot of help, just packing up all my house and moving it to his house in San Diego. Yeah. Do you remember what's the number? Do you have it?
And throughout the conversation with his friends, and this was bleeped out so that the number would not become public, but there's continual conversation about repeating the number so that Gareth knew his friends would be able to remember his brother's phone number and reach out and help his brother.
I saw.
Did you really?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, you saw Dave. It's a Dave thing.
Yeah, no, I'm in total isolation. So I'm in a cell alone all
So that's why you have the public defender, huh? You spent all that money to get the bail out for one day.
Yeah, for like 15 hours.
15 hours.
Yeah. And yeah, so obviously my work fired me, or they probably are, I assume. I don't know. I assume they are. And yeah, and my brother had to do all this for our dad dying last summer, and now he has to do it all for me. So this is a lot for him to deal with. So any help you guys can do, super please.
We can do for sure.
So we're learning about Gareth's current predicament, that he's in isolation, that other than his brother, this is the first time he's had anybody else to talk to. He's in isolation, that he lost a lot of money.
Yeah, so I'm just really worried about my brother, and I'm hoping that the bail bondsman will return the money to him so they can have money. You know, it's 130 grand, every single cent I had plus some. So I'm hoping they'll get that back. He said he would, but I don't know.
How are they going to get it back? That's a third-party thing. I remember I was never able to get mine back.
The guy's saying the guy's saying he'll give it back, but I don't believe him. So right now I'm just hoping. You know, I don't know if you can help him find a legal way to do it, because the guy, basically I was out, right, and then I hadn't paid him yet, and then the guy found out they were going to bring me back into court or back into jail, and so he rushed me to he has to turn off all our phones, saying the media was tracking us, and then took me to the bank and got me to give him the money, and then he dumped me at In-N-Out and said he was going to be back, and then the task force arrested me again.
What? That sucks.
So if it turns out that he doesn't give me the money back, my brother the money back rather, if you can try and help with the legal part of trying to do that, possibly if that happens, anything, please. And yeah, so I'm really needy right now. I just need help with all these outside stuff, which sucks.
Yeah, we'll contact your brother and see what we can do to help for sure.
Thank you. And yeah, I was really.
Can we give you money for your whatever?
No, I don't want any of that. Thank you, though. I don't care about that shit. All I care about is help my brother. And if my brother gets the money back, then he could just use it's plenty. He could just use that. But I don't know. But I don't want to be used to using the store kind of a thing here. I don't care.
So as you can see, Gareth's primary concern at this point is helping his brother clean up his mess, the mess that he's created.
No, I was hit up a bunch of times already. People were trying to sell pictures and Daily Mail. One of them, it was their restraining order just ended 2 days ago, and they're you could.
No, that's a lie. It ended 15 years ago.
No, the truth came out.
Oh, okay, got it.
They put Amie on a 48-hour CBS. That 48 hours.
Oh yeah, they called my brother. They wanted me to be on it when I was out. They called us when we were out. Anything so you said they're trying to buy things, whatever. If something big ticket, money wise, comes in, then fucking sell it. Just give the money to my brother, because he's dealing with so much. I don't care. There's no. It doesn't matter. That's essentially it. Please help my brother, and hopefully.
He goes on.
Everything comes down to just helping my brother pack up my world and get it to his place. Get to San Diego, and hopefully, and he's trying to buy a house right now, so I'm hoping he can get that money back and he can use that to buy a house.
and then if I get out, I can have a room. As we become a bigger house.
And then here's one of Gareth's jokes and some other interesting information.
But that would be good for my brother. But I do have a joke for you. What's the most feminine candy bar?
Huh.
Hershey's.
Yeah, you got your sense of humor. You're making the best of it. Hey,
Yeah.
did you get to give you a pen and paper to actually like write stuff
No,
down there?
not yet. I'm trying to get a pencil. I have a piece of paper, but I haven't got a pencil yet. What is it?
He's in a position where he has absolute no autonomy, can't even get a pencil, completely relying on people to help him in the most basic ways. And let me make a comment about the use of humor. Hernando Chavez made a comment during his testimony about using humor as a defense mechanism. He explained to all of us that even though he was in shock and grieving while he met with police officers after Amie Harwick's death, he still interacted with people, still worked, and still saw clients. And then he explained that humor is a defense mechanism. People will cope with grief and loss and shock in different ways. He said he could feel deep shock and sadness and also be able to do all the things he described. So the use of humor as a defense mechanism does not mean someone is cold and callous. Moving on.
And I'm definitely not employable anymore if I get out. That's fun. So, or not, I don't know, shit. Yeah, if I get the money back, then...
You know, one day at a time, man. Let's try to get
Who
your...
knows what kind of footprints they have, and who knows, you might get out, man, you know? Maybe. Maybe you'll be found in... right now I just need to treat it like a knot, because Hope is killer in here. Yeah, I just need my brother to be helped so that he can be solid and just go with it and all that, and then and yeah, that's essentially it.
So you hear that he says he doesn't want to have hope. He's just trying to make it day by day. This is the last clip.
Okay, you can like see it on your door. And when I was first brought in here, they had me on like suicide watch. So I was sleeping. I had like a tarp, like a poncho made out of tarp, like plastic tarp, as clothing. That was my clothing instead of real clothes. So now I'm wearing normal clothes now. But yeah, before it was a nightmare. For like a week, I was wearing a tarp. Not the most comfortable thing.
So now we know that he's also been on suicide watch during his incarceration. So we established during testimony that this tape was made about 16, 17 days after Mr. Purshouse's arrest. 16, 17 days of being in isolation for his chance to be able to speak to some other people. Now, the prosecution has offered some unreliable evidence to you to support their theory that Mr. Pursehouse had always intended to kill Amie Harwick. The prosecution, during their opening argument, specifically talked to you about Hernando Chavez and his comments about what he heard at the XBiz Awards and Aspen Jamison's comments, and compared the two. And as you recall, Aspen Jamison said she heard Mr. Pursehouse say, "Funny seeing you here," when he first came up. And something along the lines of, "You fucking ruined my life." Now, the use of the word fucking is something, as you can hear from these clips is something Mr. Pursehouse says, but that doesn't mean he uses it in a way that's hostile or angry. But when Mr. Chavez indicated that he heard the statement, there's an embellishment. He claims to have heard, when he testified, he claimed to have heard Gareth Pursehouse call Amie Harwick a bitch. Now, when confronted about that statement on cross-examination, Hernando Chavez admitted that previously, on February 18th, 2020, when he was interviewed by detectives about what he observed at the XBiz Awards, he told detectives he did not hear Gareth call Amie a bitch. But suddenly, when it comes time to present testimony, it's a new recollection that he has. And these new recollections need to be looked at carefully, because they're a way the prosecution can try to put their thumb on the scale by embellishing the facts. And we need to have a fair trial here. And that means the evidence offered by the prosecution needs to be examined critically. You can't just accept something someone says because they're saying it under oath, but you have to examine all the circumstances and whether they've made prior inconsistent statements and evaluating the veracity of their testimony. Hernando Chavez was one of Amie Harwick's closest friends. And I can't fault him for wanting to remember things in a way that helps prosecute the person that he thinks is responsible for her death. I don't think he's a bad person for that. But that doesn't mean we don't critically examine his testimony. So I ask you to disregard that statement, because Gareth Pursehouse did not call Amie Harwick that word. And we have corroboration of that, because Gareth Pursehouse did not call Amie Harwick that word, and Amie Harwick did not note it in her email to herself. If he had said that, you would think Amie Harwick would have written it in her email to herself.
I'm going to ask you to consider that other than the state of mind exception.
Right, sustained.
Another reason to doubt Mr. Chavez's testimony is his recollection of the second conversation that occurred at the XBiz Awards. You'll recall when he testified, he told us that he remembered after Amie and Gareth walked away from their table in the award ceremony, he went out and sat on a chair and watched the entire conversation. But the text messages between he and Amie Harwick showed that is not what happened. This is defense C. So during that second conversation, Amie Harwick texts Hernando Chavez and says, "I'm around to the right talking, I'm okay." And he sends the hand emojis. And then follows up at 11:39, about 15 minutes later, still talking. If he were sitting there watching them, he wouldn't have to ask. And she says yes. And he responds, "Okay, I'll be floating around. I'll walk you to your car." So he's off floating around while Amie and Gareth are talking. And then he says, "Let me know when you're ready." And she says, "Okay, just a few min, almost done." And then he asks where she is. "Are you downstairs or upstairs? Where should I head towards?" And then she tells him where to find her. And that's because he was not sitting there watching. His recollection cannot be trusted. Prosecution has also asked you to believe that Amie Harwick could not have fallen over the balcony railing of her own volition because they want you to believe she was strangled to unconsciousness. However, the evidence does not support that interpretation of what happened. Dr. Luzzi testified what he would expect to happen if someone was strangled to unconsciousness, and he made a point of saying he would suspect that she would lose control of her bowel and bladder. There was no losing control of bowels in this case. There is a suspicion that there was urine there. We don't know who that urine belonged to, if it belonged to a person or her cat. But without the bowel movement, we cannot say Amie Harwick was strangled to unconsciousness. And someone can urinate themselves just by being startled and screaming the way Amie Harwick was described to be screaming by Michael Herman. Dr. Luzzi said it takes 15 to 20 seconds for someone to lose consciousness if they're strangled. Michael Herman says he was downstairs listening to what happened. And during the trial, for the first time, Michael Herman testified that it became eerily silent after he heard choking sounds. All of Michael Herman's prior statements indicated all he heard was Amie Harwick constantly screaming, that there were no moments of quiet. But by trial, his testimony changed, and suddenly there was an eerie silence, which we're supposed to assume meant she was unconscious. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not what happened. Amie Harwick was conscious and screaming the entire time. I want to go through some of the prior inconsistent statements of Michael Herman with you. This is from Exhibit 28. At 1:25 a.m., Michael Herman's initial encounter with the first responders, Officer Fissick and his partner, Eddie.
Hey, sir. Hi. How can I help you?
My roommate was attacked. I know it. I heard it. She's screaming. She was thrown to the ground. I couldn't find my phone. I couldn't find anything.
Okay, hold on. Okay, so you have access to here?
No.
Is there anybody else inside the house?
My roommate.
Just your roommate by yourself?
Yes. You didn't check on her? Dude, I heard screaming. I don't know if that guy had a gun or a knife. I came running I couldn't find my phone or anything.
So is there somebody else inside?
Yes. So I think there's
Okay, sir, do me a favor. Do me a favor. Calm down. Calm down. Other than your roommate, is there anybody else inside the house?
I don't know.
So you didn't see anyone?
No, I just heard her screaming. I got thrown to the ground. I've been calling for her through his windows. Nobody's answering. Nothing.
Yeah, let's get an additional unit.
That's not building search.
Yeah, I know, but...
A few minutes later,
What's going on?
My roommate got attacked.
She attacked, or...?
Yes, I heard her screaming. I was dead asleep. I couldn't find my phone. I couldn't find her web. I couldn't find anything. I ran to go to the neighbors. Nobody's answering the door.
Does she have a boyfriend that's here?
No, she doesn't have a boyfriend. The last I heard, she saw a guy who she had a restraining order against a long time ago. She saw him at a conference somewhere.
Was there anybody else here? Or?
Not that I know of. Well, there was, obviously, but I mean, I didn't know they were.
Or could she have fallen?
No, dude, I heard screaming. I heard screaming in the house for as I'm looking for everything. Like, she's screaming the whole time. And I couldn't find anything. It was upstairs. She didn't fall. Trust me. I would have seen her when I came out. I came out this way to hug the fence to try and get help.
Yep. Yeah, I see you. Did you hear any other voices other than hers?
the ambulance getting here?
It's on its way.
Is there anything that anybody can do? Like,
Because of a head injury and we're not trained, and I don't know if there's neck injury. That's what the fire department should be here in just a second. What was she screaming? Did you just yelling?
Just yelling.
And then the officers found her out here?
Yes.
Like
We
this?
were
Yeah.
walking her back, like, to get back in, and she was laying there. At first I thought it was a doll. I was like, you gotta be freaking kidding me. Like,
And then at 2:09 a.m.
she was yelling the whole time. You know, looking for a weapon. I'm trying to find the phone.
Yeah.
Then I shout, Amie, you know, yelling, and then I'm in here looking for all this stuff. Then I run out the back door, and they're still screaming the whole time. I'm telling you, it sounded like a struggle. Like,
Yeah.
I just didn't know how many. I just didn't want them to stay anymore. Like, you know.
At 2:09 a.m.
Now, she was still upstairs yelling when I ran out.
Right.
And at 7:54 a.m.
All right. She was still yelling when I left. Okay. She was yelling the whole time, telling me. That's why I knew. That's why I knew. I knew that there was somebody else in here.
Okay, now this is kind of strange, but can you yell? What did it sound like to you? Okay, just a panic yell.
Yeah.
She didn't say like stop, don't.
No.
She didn't yell a name. Nothing, with words. It was just the sounds.
Yeah.
Sounds of screams. Okay, and so.
Just the sounds of screams. No choking, no moments of silence. She was screaming the whole time. And then at 9:41 a.m. at the LAPD station. Oh, no, for that 7:55 a.m., I'm sorry.
How far are you when you can't hear the screaming? I don't know. I just heard them when I still left the door. When you walk out the door, it was just as it was like coming out. I still hear it. You still hear the screaming.
And when you're
And then at the station at 9:41 a.m. Oops.
And can you remember? Do you still hear screaming?
I still heard screaming when I was
Still hear screaming. Yeah, and we're at the house.
Because when I was yelling, because when I was leaving, I yelled up there, "Hey, motherfucker!" like really loud, because I wanted her to think I was going upstairs, so maybe he'd like stop and run. You know, that
Even though that he's not in the house alone, two of them.
Right. And I didn't know it was like, I didn't know there's multiple people. I just didn't know, and I just hoped that would that they would make the person flee.
Right. And besides besides hearing her screaming, what else did you hear?
That's all I remember hearing.
Well, didn't you mentioned to me that you heard like
Oh, well, yeah, this shuffling.
shuffling?
Yeah.
From
I'm not a person. Yeah. It sounded like that wasn't when I was like running out. That was when I was yelling at Amie. That was when it felt like I heard shuffling.
Okay. Did you hear?
Because when I ran out, I just yelled, "Hey, motherfucker," and then I ran out.
So you see Amie and you hear the shuffling.
Yeah.
And then you go into the room, you come back out of the room, she's still screaming.
Yeah.
And then you yell back up again, and then you exit through the back door. Besides the shuffling, her screaming, do you remember, did you hear anything else like banging or clanking or
No, that was all I
things
heard.
falling down? Okay.
So detectives ask him point blank, what else did you hear? And there's still no mention of choking or moments where she stopped screaming. It's consistent. It's consistent with her being conscious and screaming the entire time that he was able to hear things. There was no moments of eerie silence. Amie Harwick was not strangled to unconsciousness. Another issue that has arisen is during the autopsy, Dr. Luzzi wrote a report documenting the injuries that he found on Amie Harwick. But for the first time during his testimony at trial, he mentioned a new injury. He testified to nasal fractures, something that he did not include in his report, and he admitted that when he testified. He did not include evidence of nasal fractures in his report. And he indicated in his testimony that what he was relying on to conclude that she had received nasal fractures that he said were consistent with being punched in the face. He relied on a PowerPoint provided to him by the prosecutors. He did not know, Dr. Luzzi did not know where the images on the PowerPoint came from, and he didn't know if the images were even from this autopsy. Dr. Luzzi admitted he made no findings of nasal fractures in the autopsy report. So based on questionable evidence, suddenly at the trial, the prosecution tries to introduce evidence of a punch in the face. Now I know when Mr. Avila was going through his opening arguments to you, he didn't mention it. And I don't know if that means they realize something's wrong with that evidence, but the prosecution...
asking the jury to speculate about what the prosecutors are thinking.
All right,
The prosecution will get another opportunity to argue to you, and I will not. This is my only opportunity to speak to you, so I do have to try to anticipate what I think they may argue. And they may argue in their rebuttal argument these nasal fractures, which are completely unreliable evidence in this case and should not be believed by you. The reason the prosecution wants this evidence before you is because they're trying to paint an inaccurate picture of what happened. They're trying to convince you that Amie Harwick was in a debilitated state because she'd been punched in the face and strangled to unconsciousness. Therefore, she could not have gone over that railing of her own volition. But the prosecution's evidence is not convincing. It is not reliable. It is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has not proven to you that Amie Harwick was incapable of climbing over that railing in an effort to escape. Michael Herman testified that he had sciatica, and that was why he didn't run upstairs to help Amie. He was afraid he wasn't in physical condition to be able to be in a fight. But even with his impaired state, he was able to climb a much higher gate, not once, but twice. Exactly the adrenaline, the exact same type of adrenaline that Michael Herman had coursing through his body that got him over that fence, not once, that spiked fence, not once but twice, was the same type of adrenaline Amie Harwick had at her disposal. And it makes sense that if you see somebody you're afraid of, you're going to run for the exit. And Amie Harwick was comfortable being on the railing of that balcony, and she had the means and the ability to climb over it. And the prosecution has not proven otherwise. Now, the prosecution has brought up the fact that we did not call Bob Malik to testify about the reconstruction. And that really tells me that the prosecution is worried about their case because they know it is their burden of proof. They are the ones who have to present evidence to you, not the defense. We get to rely on the state of the evidence. We get to rely on the prosecution's failure to prove their case to you. And they are the ones who should have hired an accident reconstruction expert to present to you definitively how they feel their interpretation of the evidence in this case is merited by the dynamics of falls and how you calculate falls and accident reconstruction. You saw the prosecution spared no expense in this case. They brought experts in from all over, experts who are very learned, experts who charge a lot of money. They paid over $65,000 to get a 3D sanitized, I call it, sanitized recreation of 2086 mound and 2080 mound. But they did not present you with evidence to tell you how Amie Harwick came to land in the position she was in at the bottom of that balcony. That's on the prosecution. It's their burden to prove it to you, and they have failed to do that. I forgot to also mention one other fallacy, a couple other fallacies about the autopsy and the signs of the beating to the face. If Amie Harwick had been punched in the face and received those nasal fractures, there would have been blood. And there is no blood on the balcony, in the bedroom, in the hallway between the blue room and Amie Harwick's bedroom, anywhere, to substantiate a claim that she was punched in the face with such force that she caused nasal fractures and she was debilitated. All of the blood was where she came to land, which is consistent with injuries from a fall. Also, you saw photographs of Gareth Purshouse's hands. Now, the prosecution made a point of telling you that there are no cuts on Gareth Purshouse's hands because he was wearing gloves. Now, I dispute and I disagree that they have proven he was wearing gloves inside the house, and we'll talk more about that later. But primarily what I want you to focus on is the fact that his hands were not bruised. If he is punching somebody with such force to cause nasal fractures, you would see bruising to his hands, and there was no bruising to substantiate that type of assaultive injuries. Gloves would not protect you from those types of bruises. Gloves would not protect your hands from showing signs of hitting somebody with enough force to break their nasal cavity. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it was Amie Harwick who left her DNA on the balcony door. I'm showing you People's Exhibit 93. You'll remember Nick Sanchez, I believe, was the witness who testified about collecting a swab, collecting biological evidence from this area. And we asked him to tell us where it was collected from. Showing you B. And you can't see on this photograph, he said, where it was collected from. But he claimed it was to the right of this little measurement device, this ruler. If Gareth Pursehouse had left Amie Harwick's DNA on this doorknob, or on this door, in this area, then you would have expected to find it here. This is defense AAA. This is the kitchen door that was left open, that the prosecution claims Mr. Pursehouse ran out. And if you look closely, you see that this door, it requires a doorknob to be opened and a deadbolt to be opened. Yet no DNA was found on this door. It was Amie Harwick who opened that balcony door and left her DNA. It was Amie Harwick who went out on that balcony on her own volition. It was Amie Harwick who, in an attempt to escape Mr. Pursehouse, in a panicked state, screaming, tried to climb over the balcony to get away. Even if Mr. Pursehouse were wearing gloves, that DNA would have been on that kitchen door if it came from him. If the balcony door had DNA from those gloves still would have been able to transfer DNA on that kitchen door, but there was no DNA there. And that's because Mr. Pursehouse was not the one who left the DNA, Amie Harwick's DNA, on that balcony door. The prosecution has a theory they're trying to convince you of, that this nicotine syringe was intended to be used as a weapon. That it was intended to be used as a weapon by Gareth Pursehouse against Amie Harwick. There are several problems with that theory. First, the prosecution was arguing today that Gareth Pursehouse came to acquire that syringe with nicotine after the XBiz Awards. The evidence does not support that. First, it's completely speculative. But we actually have evidence that indicates that syringe was an old syringe, that nicotine in the syringe was dated and old and had started to decompensate. If you recall, there was testimony from Dr. Benowitz about nicotine. Dr. Benowitz testified that nicotine is a clear substance. It's clear like water. And as it breaks down, it turns darker shades of brown. Here, this nicotine had turned so brown, it was mistaken to be tar heroin by the officers who responded to 2086 Mound. That's how brown this clear liquid had turned. Dr. Benowitz testified it would take months or years for nicotine to break down outside the body. So this nicotine,
That's not an evidence. Interesting.
that is Dr. Benewitz's testimony, that it takes months or years to break down outside of the body. So this syringe containing nicotine would take months to years to turn that brown. This indicates that Gareth Pursehouse had it for a longer period of time, which means he didn't acquire it to use it against Amie Harwick. He acquired it months or years prior to encountering her.
I'm going to object to facts not in evidence.
All right, counsel, that's correct. Sustained.
This indicates that this syringe was not intended for Amie Harwick. It indicates he did not acquire it after the XBiz Awards. The color verifies this. The color of this clear liquid had changed over time because it had started to break down. The prosecution also wants you to believe this myth that nicotine is somehow undetectable or too difficult and would have been used to commit the perfect crime. But let's look at the circumstances here. First, whether or not it was even intended to be a weapon. How was Gareth Pursehouse supposed to be able to inject her? Dr. Benowitz talked about trying to inject somebody intravenously who's resisting and struggling. The prosecution is trying to manufacture some way for Mr. Pursehouse to have restrained her in order to apparently inject her with this syringe. And they even are so desperate that they point to the drawstring on his shorts and try to make a claim that it's somehow a piece of rope or string or something that he could have used, which is ludicrous. They also collected this piece of evidence on Ivar Street, behind that empty lot where we saw those trash cans lined up. This tangled web of wires somehow might be evidence in this case. Is their theory that he was going to untangle this mass of wires and somehow use it?
No, Jack, this states the arguments made.
It's ludicrous. This syringe was not to be used on Amie Harwick. It is not an effective weapon unless you have a means of injecting someone intravenously. And even a phlebotomist would have trouble doing that. I know when my daughter was 3 years old and I had to take her to the doctor for routine immunization, it took 3 grown adults to restrain her in order to get a shot. Now, I mean, maybe that's not politically correct anymore to admit that you physically restrained your child, but that was the reality. This was not intended to be a weapon. If you look at the syringe, when you are in the jury room, look at the syringe. Look at how long that needle is. The syringe wasn't even completely full. We have to assume that this was brought for some other purpose, because it is not a weapon. If Mr. Pursehouse intended to kill Amie Harwick, wouldn't there be a lot of other efficient, meaningful ways to do it other than bringing a syringe? That syringe was intended for somebody else. We know that when Mr. Pursehouse was arrested and he was detained at the Twin Towers facility, he was put on suicide watch. We know that Dr. Benowitz acknowledged that if you do a Google search for nicotine, that you will see literature documenting the use of nicotine for suicide.
Objection pursuant to the court's order.
Sustained.
Dr. Benowitz testified that a Google search for nicotine will reveal scientific literature validating the use of nicotine in suicide.
I'm going to object to this on proceeding the court's ruling.
Well, no, that court will allow it just for that limited purpose. I think that the doctor did testify to something to that effect, so, but.
And Dr. Benowitz also testified that if you want to commit suicide, the most efficient way to do it using nicotine would be an intravenous injection.
I'm going to object that misstates the testimony.
Does, okay, sustained. Let's move on, Kim.
Dr. Benowitz talked about the way nicotine is metabolized. And he indicated that if someone tries to kill themselves ingesting nicotine orally, it is not an effective way, because the way the nicotine is metabolized, it has to go through the stomach first, and people get sick and they throw up. And by throwing up, they release the poison from their body, and it's not effective. But Dr. Benowitz acknowledged the most efficient way for the body to metabolize nicotine for suicide is via an injection. And that using it via an injection means you need a much smaller dosage. Because if you're going to try to kill yourself using an oral dose,
Trying to kill yourself. No, it seems not an evidence.
Your Honor, this is part of the evidence.
Well, again, if you kept it in a general sense, what you were doing, and that the most efficient way of doing it would have been by use of a needle as opposed to taking it orally, you're right, you would have thrown up and so forth. Keep it in that general sense, the court will allow you to do that. Otherwise, I'm sustaining the objection.
Okay, well, Dr. Benowitz did testify that the intravenous injection was the most efficient way of, whether it's intravenous, intramuscular, or taking nicotine by orally, intravenous is the most efficient way to commit suicide.
We'll be taking a break soon, ladies and gentlemen.
Also,
How much longer do you have, Counsel? Just a second.
it's hard to say, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead for another 5 minutes. Well, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a break now. Let's go.
Welcome back. An hour and a half flies by when you're having fun, apparently. I'm shocked. I just want to make one last point on the fallacy of this undetectable nicotine. We had testimony from a criminalist, Philip Nahn, who did a narcotics analysis of the syringe containing the nicotine. It came back negative for any type of controlled substances. However, it was run through this GCMS machine, which compares unknown samples to a library, comparing chemical properties of an unknown substance to the chemical properties of known substances, which are preserved in a library. And when the results came out showing that there were no controlled substances, other items were detected. And we're going to look at the big numbers over here, to the right, and this is, I'm showing you defense NN. So the second library run shows nicotine with the highest number of 97. And it shows other items as well. Pyridine, cotinine, which is a metabolite of nicotine. You can hardly say nicotine is an undetectable property when it is so easily discovered by the GCMS machine in its analysis when it was only looking for controlled substances. Now, Dr. Wu testified about his analysis of the nicotine. This nicotine was analyzed by a lot of people. Dr. Bradley, first after LAPD, got this library result. You'll remember Guy Holloman, who's the supervisor of Philip Nahn at the LAPD lab, suggested that the FBI do the confirmation test to determine what, in fact, was in the syringe, since LAPD did not have a standard or a sample by which to compare the nicotine. So they don't do that. So they sent it to the FBI on Guy Holloman's recommendation, and it was confirmed, because that's what it was. So this is not undetectable. Now, the prosecution, in their examination of other witnesses, brought up the fact that there are these other substances in there. This, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. Pyridine, P-H-R-I-D-I-N-E, has a 97. But Dr. Wu explained when he testified, they were only testing for nicotine. And rounding up, they found that the liquid in the syringe contained 87% nicotine. What was the other 13%? Well, it wasn't confirmed because Dr. Wu was only testing for nicotine, but this was not a pure sample. So 13% of the substance inside that nicotine is still unknown to us. But nicotine was detected, and I hope we can lay to rest the fallacy of nicotine being this undetectable substance. The prosecution introduced evidence that Mr. Pursehouse had on his computer or accessed via his computer a device, an external hard drive, that had a file with the name Whorephone on it. And the prosecution is trying to get you to believe that the naming of that file is evidence of his hatred and desire to kill Amie Harwick. The problem with that is that the naming of that file was done in 2012 and has nothing to do with Mr. Pursehouse's state of mind in 2020. There was a stipulation, and the second line of the stipulation says, the original path file name, which contains Whorephone, was created in 2012. So that naming convention was in 2012 when Mr. Pursehouse and Amie Harwick split up and he believed she had cheated on him. The prosecution is trying to get you to speculate as to what happened between Amie Harwick and Gareth Pursehouse on the 3rd floor of 2086 Mound. Unfortunately, the prosecution did not obtain the Nest camera audio and video from that evening. And the reason they did not obtain it is because LAPD officers, detectives who filed a search warrant failed to make a preservation request. And Google only retains Nest video for 5 days on the type of account Amie Harwick had. You would expect law enforcement in investigating a crime of this magnitude would know that Google does not retain Nest video indefinitely. And there is an urgency in obtaining this evidence, an urgency and an opportunity to resolve questions that are still outstanding. But the prosecution did not file that preservation request, even though witnesses such as Robert Koshland told them, hurry up and get that Nest video. So when the prosecution claims that the evidence shows one thing or another, remember, it is their burden of proof. And if the Nest video would have resolved some of these issues, the failure to get that evidence is on the prosecution. And any of ambiguities as a result of the loss of that evidence should be resolved in favor of the defense. I'd like to talk to you a bit about some of the jury instructions that you're going to have, and you've already been instructed on. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just talking first about first-degree murder. The prosecution has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the killing was first-degree murder rather than a lesser crime. And you're going to be asked to consider lesser crimes in this case. If the people have not met this burden, you must find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder, and the murder is second-degree murder. Continuing on first-degree murder, deliberation and premeditation. These are the things that the prosecution must prove in order for there to be a finding of first-degree murder. The prosecution must prove that the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation. Willfully means he intended to kill. The prosecution has not established that Mr. Pursehouse went to 2086 Mound with the intention to kill Amie Harwick. That
I want to object. That misstates the law. Rule 3.
Overruled. You can go.
deliberately, that the defendant carefully weighed the considerations for, and against his choice, and knowing the consequences, decided to kill. And premeditation, if he decided to kill before completing the acts that caused death. And then we're going to go on to the next one, which talks about deliberation and premeditation. And this is important because a decision to kill made rashly, impulsively, or without careful consideration is not deliberate and premeditated. So if somebody makes a rash decision in the heat of a moment, as opposed to having arrived at that location with the intention to kill, that is insufficient for there to be deliberation and premeditation. Let's talk about first-degree murder by means of lying in wait. The defendant needs to conceal his purpose from the person killed, wait and watch for an opportunity to act, and then, from a position of advantage, intend to and did make a surprise attack on the person killed. It is not sufficient to merely show the elements of waiting and watching and concealment. The prosecution must prove that the defendant did those physical acts with the intent to take the victim unaware and for the purpose of facilitating an attack. And the prosecution has not shown, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mr. Pursehouse went to 2086 Mount Street in order to attack or harm Amie Harwick. Provocation for second-degree murder. Provocation reduces a murder from first degree to second degree when provocation raises a reasonable doubt about premeditation or deliberation. If you conclude the defendant committed murder but was provoked, consider the provocation in deciding whether the crime was first or second degree murder. And let me say this. Provocation is not defined as that does not require that the person provoked be provoked in a way which requires them to act in self-defense. The type of provocation we're talking about is any type of provocation that causes someone to get into an emotional state that disrupts their ability to premeditate and to deliberate. And going back to the deliberation, deliberation requires that someone carefully weigh the considerations for and against his choice, and knowing the consequence, decide to kill. So someone who acts under the heat of a moment, as opposed to somebody who actually premeditates willfully and deliberately, is not first-degree murder. Provocation to get to second-degree murder. Provocation reduces a murder from first degree to second degree when provocation raises a reasonable doubt about premeditation or deliberation. If you conclude that the defendant committed murder but was provoked, consider the provocation in deciding whether the crime was first or second degree murder. And provocation, again, is an emotional state created by the circumstances surrounding the person's decision making. A killing that would otherwise be murder is reduced to voluntary manslaughter if the defendant killed someone because of a sudden quarrel or heat of passion. Heat of passion can be any violent or intense emotion that causes a person to act without due deliberation and reflection. So violent or intense emotions are exactly the type of emotions that cause someone to be considered provoked for the purpose of second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. Sufficient provocation may occur over a short or long period of time. So in determining whether Gareth Pursehouse was suffering under the type of emotional strain, an emotional state of being that predated running into Amie Harwick, you can consider the totality of the years of burden he was carrying, all of the years of emotions he was carrying, and deciding his mental state and finding that there was provocation in his case. Well, sufficient provocation can occur over a short or long period of time, and you're entitled to consider his state of mind as he explained it to Amie Harwick in their text messages exchange.
I'm going to object using the state of mind again as actual evidence of defendant's intent.
The prosecution has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not kill as the result of a sudden quarrel or in the heat of passion. If the prosecution has not met this burden, you must find the defendant not guilty of murder. You do not, regarding the lying in wait special circumstance, you do not need to even consider the special circumstance allegation if you find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder and guilty of second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. The lying in wait special circumstance has additional elements. It requires an intentional killing committed while lying in wait, and a person commits murder by lying in wait when they conceal their purpose from the person killed, they watch and wait for an opportunity to act, and then with a surprise attack on the person killed from a position of advantage, they intend to kill the person by taking them by surprise. So this requires that the person committing a surprise attack actually intend to kill the person. Here, we did not have a surprise attack. Here, we did not have the intention by Mr. Pursehouse to harm or kill Amie Harwick. And finally, burglary also requires, in this case, that Mr. Pursehouse entered 2086 Mound with the intent to commit murder. Given that Mr. Pursehouse did not intend to commit first-degree murder, the only way you could convict Mr. Pursehouse of burglary is if you find him guilty of second-degree murder. If you find him guilty of voluntary manslaughter, the burglary count cannot be found to be true. Finally, circumstantial evidence. This is important because if you can draw two or more reasonable conclusions from the circumstantial evidence in this case, and one of those reasonable conclusions supports a finding of not guilty or an untrue finding, you must conclude the allegation was not proved by the circumstantial evidence. And I want to talk the last instruction about flight, because the prosecution is claiming that Gareth Pursehouse, by running away from 2086 Mound, showed consciousness of guilt. And I want to talk about what flight really means. If Gareth Pursehouse was at Amie Harwick's home with the intention to speak to her and not to harm her, and things went terribly wrong, and she fell to her death, and he never intended to harm her, that would create a situation in which he would have a fight or flight response, a typical physiological reaction to any type of stressful event, which is something we've seen in this case. Michael Herman had this response. He ran. I believe the evidence supports the conclusion that Amie Harwick had this fight or flight response, and she ran for the balcony railing. And Gareth Pursehouse is no different. Having things go sideways and end up with a terrible result, it's not inconsistent with an innocent state of mind to run in panic. But you also have to consider that actual professionals did not attend to Amie Harwick when they encountered her lying on the pavement. Actual professionals who were trained, LAPD officers, did not attend to Amie Harwick in a way to try to help with her injuries, because the injuries were so severe that no layperson could do anything, and even the paramedics acted very deliberately and cautiously in treating Amie Harwick. So it's unfair for the prosecution to only assume that Mr. Pursehouse's reaction in running from 2086 Mound leads to a finding of consciousness of guilt. Now, if Mr. Pursehouse had planned this, as the prosecution claims, you would expect Mr. Pursehouse to actually flee. This is a man with means to be able to run from detection by police. This is a man with money in the bank. He could have gone to his brother's house in San Diego. He could have crossed the border to Mexico. He could have flown. He could have literally flown away.
I'm gonna object on for speculation.
I'll allow it.
And he did not. Mr. Pursehouse knew there were signs of forced entry at 2086 Mound. Mr. Pursehouse knew. He was on the next door neighbor's Ring video. Mr. Pursehouse knew he had made a scene at the XBiz Awards that was not going to go undetected if some harm came to Amie Harwick. And what did Mr. Pursehouse do? He stayed home. He didn't leave. He waited. He waited for what he knew was coming, the inevitable arrest. He did not flee. Not only that, the prosecution is claiming they found evidence in his home to tie him to what happened at 2086 Mound. They found a syringe, the same type of syringe, in the kitchen. They found gloves, which they say to you today may be the same gloves. Mr. Pursehouse didn't dispose of this evidence. If Gareth Pursehouse' plan all along was to kill Amie Harwick, wouldn't you expect him to try to evade the authorities? Instead of staying home, making no attempt to flee, no attempt to escape. He stayed home at the address on his driver's license where he was arrested. On February 14th, 2020, Gareth Pursehouse went to 2086 Mount Street because he lost control of his overwhelming emotions. Breaking into 2086 Mount Street was an impulsive decision. He impulsively broke into Amie Harwick's home in the heat of his emotions in a desperate attempt to talk to Amie Harwick. He believed there was only one way forward for him, to talk to her, to get her to release him from his agonizing pain of unresolved grief due to their breakup. He had regrets he needed to share with her. There were things left unsaid at the XBiz Awards that he still needed to say. He needed to be heard and understood. His actions were not carefully considered. Instead, his actions were the result of rash, impulsive, and erratic thoughts brought to the forefront by his emotional state. Her death was never his goal. Her death would not alleviate his pain. He needed to talk to her. The intensity of his devotion to her was terrifying to him. We agree, Gareth Pursehouse had no business being in her home, but that doesn't mean he is guilty of first-degree murder or of lying in wait or the lying in wait special circumstance. What likely happened that night is that when Gareth was in the house, Amie came home, and we don't know what time she came home. We don't know what time she arrived at 2086 Mound, and we don't know what time she walked in. All we know is she got a text message about 1:02, 1:01 a.m. But we don't know where she was exactly when she got that message. We do know her phone was on her bed. We don't know where in her house Gareth Pursehouse was at that time when she was on the third floor. We don't know if he was downstairs and came up the main stairwell to the third floor. We don't know if he was already on the third floor. Nest camera video would have been helpful to make that determination, but we don't have that. Michael Herman testified that he awoke to the sound of Amie screaming, and at first he thought it was a mouse. The screaming didn't stop, so he started to wonder something was wrong. He said the only other time he'd heard someone scream like that is when somebody had seen a mouse. So he screams out as loud as he can, "Amie!" And then he says things change. Before, her screams were staying in one place. She wasn't being jostled. There was no movement. But after he heard Amie, then he started hearing the shuffling he described. He heard two bodies go to the ground. We don't know who initiated the physical confrontation. You might assume that because Gareth Pursehouse was the larger person, he did it, but we can't make assumptions when it's the prosecution's burden to prove this case beyond all reasonable doubt. It is just as likely, if not likelier, that after Amie had spoken to Michael Herman about this person, about increasing security in her home, and making Michael Herman aware that this person might be somebody to be concerned about, that they came up, that it was in her mind at least, that Michael Herman, by shouting up Amie, was on his way to come render her assistance. And she preemptively attacked Gareth Pursehouse in order to subdue him because she was afraid of him. Without an opportunity to know why he came, she preemptively attacked him. A struggle resulted from this interaction. We don't know how it began exactly, but we do know that she was screaming for quite some time, minutes, Michael Herman said, while he fumbled around before he screamed up Amie. And if Gareth Pursehouse had intended to attack Amie Harwick, why wait while she screamed? Why not attack her immediately? And the answer to that is because he didn't intend to attack her. Her screams, her fear, it's an understandable response. But that does not mean Gareth Pursehouse had any intention to harm her. In his voicemail, in the text they exchange, even in their conversation at the XBiz Awards, Gareth Pursehouse made no threats of physical violence against Amie Harwick. The fact is that he was triggered by this series of events, triggered to the point where he felt he had no choice but to go to 2086 Mount Street to show Amie Harwick in the most dramatic fashion he could. His pain was real, and convince her he needed to speak to her. The evidence unequivocally shows that Gareth Pursehouse was a man in crisis. He was struggling. He was struggling to deal with the emotional fallout he was grappling with in the years after his breakup with Amie Harwick. And when he saw her at the XBiz Awards, that dam he had built to try to repress all of his pain and all of his emotions, that dam burst and the floodwaters were released. And he could no longer control the tsunami of his emotions. Prosecution has not proven that Gareth Pursehouse went there to kill or harm Amie Harwick. The prosecution has not proven he deliberately caused her to fall over the balcony railing. Prosecution has not disproven that Gareth Pursehouse was acting due to his emotional provocation, nor have they disproven he acted in the heat of passion. For these reasons, we ask you to return a just and proper verdict in this case. We ask you to find Gareth Pursehouse not guilty of first-degree murder and not guilty of the lying in wait special circumstance. Thank you.